Once in a dark and gloomy forest, a pack of wolves surrounded a lone warrior. Their leader was a furious beast of enormous size and intelligence. Stepping forward amidst the aggressive growls of the other pack members, he addressed the brave warrior, asking him how he intended to fight them without sharp fangs or powerful claws. However, in just a moment, the lone warrior no longer appeared as weak and defenseless as he did before. Amongst the encircling wolves, who were growling menacingly, there was another creature. It stood on all fours, leaning its head toward the ground, propping itself up with two powerful clawed paws. Its skin, covered in spikes resembling scales, was jet black. In the next moment, the creature rose onto its hind legs, standing at full height. This creature turned out to be a humanoid lizard with a menacing toothy smile and eyes that shone with bright red light. It also possessed a powerful physique that struck fear into anyone who looked at it. However, even after witnessing this, the pack leader was not inclined to retreat and let out a fierce howl. Following their leader's command, the wolves viciously attacked. But despite their numerical advantage, they still had no chance. The humanoid lizard effortlessly dispatched them one by one, using its clawed paw to swiftly end each wolf's life. This was because the lizard-like creature's primary weapon was not its teeth and claws, but sweat and blood, flesh and bone. Stepping on the next wolf with its clawed paw, it instantaneously took the creature's life. At the same time, the pack leader, with rage in its eyes, watched as its kin were mercilessly destroyed by the once feeble warrior. Unable to bear it any longer, it let out a furious roar, then opened its massive jaws with sharp fangs and lunged at the lizard-like monster. But victory was not in the cards for it. In the next moment, the humanoid lizard intercepted the pack leader's attack, grabbing it by the jaw with its strong, clawed paw. Addressing the furious creature it held, the lizard said that it consumed the bodies of its enemies and used them as its weapons. After sinking its sharp teeth into the wolf pack leader's throat, it declared with a bloodthirsty voice that it would kill him, and by devouring him, it would become even stronger. In this world of magical beings with unique abilities, they were referred to as mystical creatures. A small number of people were also granted the ability to transform into mystical creatures. They served as prophets who worked for the betterment of humanity. But, as always, where there was good, there was also evil. In this world, there existed embodiments of this divine power, which people referred to with trepidation as the demonic god. In the midst of a dark forest, a man was running. His silhouette was shrouded in darkness, while his breathing was erratic and heavy. Rushing with all his might on his exhausted legs, the young man, with tears in his eyes and a desperate voice, was no longer able to scream. His vision was blurred, and he moved only by fear and survival instincts. The reason he was fleeing was an arrow loaded into a crossbow and aimed directly at his back. In the next moment, the sound of the released bowstring resounded, followed immediately by the painful cry of the fleeing man, who was struck in the back by the arrow. Right after that, a joyful male voice could be heard, laughing and celebrating the accuracy of his shot. The owner of the voice was a bald middle-aged man dressed in light armor, holding a crossbow in his hands. Another man with long hair praised him for the shot. The sharpshooter proudly responded with a smirk that it was quite easy. The attacker's sword dripped with blood after murders. For men lay in their own blood without signs of life. Their attempt to defend themselves had been unsuccessful, as there were more enemies, and thus their foes celebrated victory, while those who had lost forever froze on the cold forest ground. Before sunset, they needed to take anything of value, no matter how small. The bandits quickly searched the bodies and claimed their reward. "It's just a feeling, but today the forest feels particularly eerie," said one of the criminals, and with these words, the group of criminals began their journey. A group of 9 criminals walked through a natural alley of majestic trees, which, when darkness fell upon the forest, took on eerie shapes. The group was in good spirits due to their easy pickings. A sarcastic voice came from the crowd: "What monster could be in this forest, and why would it be watching us right now?" The crowd laughed in response. "Wait," shouted the group's leader, who was walking ahead. Everyone froze. The closest killer's face was covered in sweat, and even his thick beard and the hair hanging over his forehead couldn't hide his fear. He wasn't alone in this feeling, another criminal standing nearby shared his unease. It was evident even from beneath the black hood he wore. One of the bandits who stood at the center of the group and couldn't see anything couldn't hold back and asked, "What's there?" "Animal carcasses," the bandit replied heavily. His gaze revealed a horrifying sight. The trees were marked with claw marks from some creature, and some of them were torn in half and scattered on the ground. On one of the fallen trees hung the lifeless body of a dead wolf. Mutilated animal bodies were strewn all over. Even in semi-darkness, their gray bodies were clearly visible. Their eyes had lost their gleam, and bloody puddles flowed from their mouths. Martin, the bandit with slick back hair and a 3-day stubble, knelt down to examine the nearest body. Enormous chunks of flesh had been torn from the gray creature's body, exposing its bones. The bearded man approached his comrade and asked if this might have been a territorial battle, as one pack might have clashed with another, leading to a fight. The answer from the criminal disturbed everyone. "I'm not sure, but it looks like they were cut down unilaterally. It's something powerful." The bandit examining the bodies nearby suddenly exclaimed that the leader should take a look. Martin and 2 of his closest comrades got up and headed to where the man was pointing. "This is the corpse of a mythical creature," one of the bandits said. "The carcass of a massive black wolf with deep gashes on its hide. Some areas of the skin had been ripped off along with the flesh. The beast hadn't gone down without a fight, bloody traces were everywhere." But the men were not captivated by the dead beast, instead, they were fixated on the young man leaning against the wolf's carcass. It seemed as though the young man was dead. He had short black hair, a muscular torso, and a commanding presence. The youth's attire was somewhat peculiar, with a broad belt featuring an emblem resembling a dragon's head. His upper body was bare, and his arms, starting from the shoulders, were jet black. He wore armored gauntlets on his wrists. His pants and boots were unremarkable. Sorting their thoughts, the bandit with the hood and his men approached closer. The man immediately noticed that the body behind them was the leader of the pack. "What could this scoundrel be doing here?" Martin asked, looking at the bowed head of the youth. As they gazed at the carcass of the once fearsome beast, whose fangs appeared ready to tear people to shreds, the bandit wondered if this young man could have killed the magical creature. Before he could finish voicing his thought, Martin replied, telling him not to speak nonsense. "No one cares how this vagrant got here." Martin approached the guy even closer and stretched out his hand, saying that he needed to see if he had anything useful. Before the bandit could realize his plan, a sharp pain shot through his leg, and he couldn't hold back his scream. "What is wrong with this stupid lizard?" The red lizard, the size of a yard dog, clawed at the bandit's leg. "Get away from me," the bandit shouted, trying to shake the attacker off his leg. With a smile on his face, the bandit who had shot the young man with a crossbow some time ago approached Martin. But now he was holding a different weapon, a hunting knife. "Don't move, Martin," he said. "I will cut him in 2, he added. Then he swung and struck. Suddenly, the man felt a terrible pain in his arm. Looking at the place of the greatest pain, he saw only a blood fountain where his arm should have been. His punch at the lizard never reached the target. Instead, his arm was cut off by a one-handed battle axe. A scream of pain spread through the forest. The bandits' comrades prepared to fight when they saw their comrade's hand cut off by a stranger they thought was dead. Before the one-armed man could say a word, the fist of the stranger, who had just gotten to his feet and was ready to fight, flew into his face. The bandit's face was deformed by the force of the blow. Blood seemed to be pouring out of his mouth. "Do not touch him without my permission," the stranger said with an almost demonic expression. "Or I will kill you." Teeth clenched in anger and a look full of hatred. That's what you can see on a monster's face. The lizard ran up to the boy and hid behind him, its split tongue sticking out from time to time, giving the impression that it was mocking its opponents. Its defender prepared for the battle. He was not in the best shape after the fight with the magical beast, his body covered with cuts hurt and his steps were heavy. The guy clutched the battle axe he was holding in his right hand and prepared to fight. "This bastard is starting a fight," one of the criminals shouted. Seeing the fate of their comrade, the bandits pulled out their weapons and began to approach the guy. The crowd heard a shout from the bearded man. It was he who killed Hans. Their opponent was not silent. "But this Hans seems to be still alive." The young man's answer enraged the crowd. Martin shouted out in anger, "You bastard, you think you can get away with this," and then the bandit raised his sword in front of him, preparing to attack. The order was given to surround the guy. At the same moment, 3 bandits stood in front of the guy and pointed their weapons at him. "Fools!" the young man said, pulling another axe from behind his back. "Do you have someone who will mourn for you? If so, retreat before it's too late." The young man prepared to fight, his eyes focused on his enemies, as if he was about to rush at them. Those who saw the boy said that a red aura covered his body, giving him a menacing look. The crimson lizard bared its teeth, showing that it was also ready to fight. "Kill him," someone from the crowd shouted. And the three closest criminals rushed forward. The guy clutched the handle tightly in his hands. The two paired axes he was wielding were formidable weapons. A blade on one side and a sharp spike on the other. Black steel with simple patterns engraved on it and a wooden handle, the perfect weapon for him. A second later, he rushed forward. His eyes, his movements, did not resemble human ones. With remarkable agility, he rushed through the crowd of enemies, cutting off their limbs. "My leg," one of the attackers shouted. Four enemies fell to the ground, screaming in pain as they tried to stop the bleeding that remained in place of their limbs. All this time the lizard was attached to the guy's back. In order not to fly off the guy, it had to cling to the warrior's shoulder with its teeth and claws. The bearded man noticed that he was a monster, looking at the agility and strength of the young man. Seeing his comrades lying in their blood, seeing limbs that were separated from their owners, the bearded man trembled. "Bastard," Martin said, standing behind the young man. While the boy was dealing with the bandits, Martin and two other criminals managed to get behind the hero. Raising their crossbows, the bandits ordered the boy to stay still. Then the other one and his men fired. The sound of the arrows fired spread around. The boy froze for a moment. He did not expect it to come to this. Without time to dodge, all he could do was grab the lizard hanging on his back and cover it with his body. Grabbing his lizard, the guy pressed it to his body. In less than a second, 3 crossbow bolts stuck into his back. A sharp pain penetrated his body, causing him indescribable suffering. The young man clenched his teeth to keep from screaming in pain. "Did we kill him?" asked the crossbowman with a scar on his eyebrow. A smile appeared on the bandit's face. Martin did not share his joy and ordered him to wait. Before he could finish speaking, a stream of flame-like energy gushed from the young man's body. This flame was black and red in color, twisting and swirling as it rose upward. This continued until the shapeless tongues began to take on animal forms. The heads of several animal-like creatures began to emerge from the black flames. In this chaos of shapes and colors, one could recognize the head of a lynx, a wolf, a lizard, and several other unknown animals. And the center of all this horror was a young man who was now screaming in pain. On his back, from his shoulders, black lines began to spread like the roots of a tree that had spread out in different directions. It seemed that blackness had penetrated the boy's veins and spread throughout his body. The toothy faces began to merge into one shape with a roar. Darkness and chaos, flame and madness mixed. To form a head that was bigger and more terrifying than all the others. A black dragon. The dragon's huge mouth was gaping as if it wanted to swallow the moon. The bandits watching this horror could not move. Fear paralyzed their bodies and souls. And then the bearded man said that it was a demon god. The guy almost lost himself. There was nothing human in his eyes, only the flames of hatred and anger. The bandit's words brought the young man back to reality, his eyes became clear. The moment he regained control, the tongues of flame that swirled above him dissipated just like a bubble that bursts and leaves nothing behind. The crimson spectacle was over and the forest returned to its darkened imprint. The young man fell to his knees, and the scaly friend did not leave his side, trying to help him somehow. The young man's body was smoking as if he had just been roasted on a fire, and this was not far from the truth. When he tried to get to his feet, he saw something strange in the trees, but he was not strong enough and lost consciousness. The night's darkness showed no signs of relenting. To provide some illumination to the settlement, the villagers lit braziers on the main street. A few houses had lights flickering in their windows. However, the interiors were empty as everyone had gathered in the square to inspect their incredible trophy. This small village was well protected with a high, nearly 3-meter wall lined with sharpened stakes. It had 2 pairs of massive wooden gates and 2 towers by the gates, manned with armed guards. The architecture of this place bore some resemblance to Scandinavian settlements. "I can't believe it," said the village leader, looking at the dead magical beast that had been brought here on a cart. The man with light hair, around 40 years old, examined the wolf once more. His eyes held surprise, even though he had seen a lot in his lifetime, as evidenced by the claw marks on his face, left by the monster. "Did you really do all of this?" the man asked, turning his gaze towards the young man who was chained and tied to a wooden beam. His small companion had been pushed into a cage from which he was desperately trying to escape by gnawing on the bars. The young man replied confidently as if he weren't bound by chains. "It would be better if you burnt it all," he said, pointing at the dead magical beast. "Tearing you to death would not have been enough," Martin shouted in anger. He was about to start making good on his threat, but the elder's hand stopped him. The elder approached the boy and asked him his name. "Ananta," the boy answered. "Why did you do that?" the old man continued to ask. Ananta's answer surprised the elder. "I was hungry." Martin intervened in a conversation, saying that one should not listen to this monster. Everyone had seen him turn into a beast. He mentioned the recent rumors about the monster eating corpses. Martin continued to insist that Ananta was not human, and he showed the scars of a wolf as proof. Drawing attention to the places where the flesh had been eaten. He insisted that the boy was a demon god in human form. Ananta began to laugh, and his mood improved greatly. When Martin asked him why he was laughing, he replied. He said that if Ananta was really who he was taken for, then these weak chains would not hold him. His words once again sowed horror in those around him. A bird flew overhead in a cloudless sky. "You know nothing, including what the monster eats," it said. Splashes of blood poured over the doused elders. He did not understand how it happened. The mystical beast that had just been dead had torn the cords that tied him to the cart and had, first of all, eaten the nearest soldier. Ananta noticed that this creature's existence was reduced to being the hands and feet of a demon god. Meanwhile, an endless stream of half-rotten wolves poured into the main gate. Their army was led by a mystical beast who pointed to the gate with his hand raised. His army completely obeyed him, and despite the crossbow fire from the village guards, the wolves climbed and jumped on the walls. A tower of animals formed at the foot of the gate. The animals climbed on top of each other, creating steps of bodies. The soldiers defending the gate from the inside could not resist the enemy. Although the wolves climbed over several individuals, there was no chance of escape for men unprepared for such a thing. The animals tore people to pieces. They bit off their heads and ate their insides. Martin was attacked by two wolves, and while one was biting into his arm, the other one, which had no flesh on the part of his skull, bit the man's neck. In all the chaos, no one noticed that one of the braziers fell on the fence and started a fire. Surprisingly, this fire could have saved people's lives. The fence burned more and more, and with it, the dead animals that continued to climb over it. As Wendigo watched his army burn, he noticed an object fly through the fence and fall at his feet. It was the severed head of a mystical beast, a black wolf. Thirst and hunger come together to break free, blood and sweat, flesh and bone. "I am fully prepared to eat you." These were the words of the dark lizard addressed to the monster that led the pack. Ananta, in the form of a beast, approached the fence and broke it like a matchbox house. The fence cracked and shattered under the onslaught of fire that left it no chance. The fence's mission failed, and the village was left without its protection. A lizard, black as ash, was making its way through the wall. Its body exuded heat while its soul burned with anger. "I will disfigure you, I will destroy you, I will make you look like a prey on the verge of death," the foot-and-mouth disease said to its opponent, another magical creature. A tall, almost 2-meter humanoid stood opposite. His face looked like a half-rotten cattle skull. In place of the nose, there was only a dip, a void. Small white eye sockets peered intently at the enemy, and long horns grew from the top of the skull, although they looked more like tree branches with one main stem and several units. Gray fur covered the beast's elongated body, with black and thicker fur on its chest and arms and something similar to tree roots growing on its back. The beast's arms were extremely long, and even when it stood on its feet, the fingers of its hands dragged along the ground. The black foot-and-mouth disease got to its feet. Its appearance inspired respect and admiration. Massive build, muscularity, and power. No vulnerable spots, its entire body covered with hard scales, and its mouth lined with sharp teeth. Its eyes were blazing red, and it was anticipating a massacre. The magical beast let out a piercing scream. This cry was not a warning, and it was an order. Beasts under the control of the Wendigo began to appear from the dark forest. His army of magically controlled beasts consisted of wolves, a goat, a deer, and a wild boar. Total obedience. With a shout, the slaves rushed at the lizard, the glint in their eyes saying that they no longer knew fear or anything else, only obedience to their master. The boar and goat were the first to reach the enemy and tried to attack with horns and tusks. And nothing happened. They could not cause any wounds or discomfort to the lizard. With its powerful arms, the black serpent caught their heads, which looked like fragile flowers, in its huge hands and slammed them to the ground. After breaking everything that was fashionable, their faces were no longer recognizable, and they turned into a mess of flesh and bones. After ending their lives, he began to step forward. With his swift strokes, Ananta divided his opponents into two until only their leader remained. The enemies met each other's eyes as if the dark serpent had seen the very essence of the Wendigo. The latter wriggled furiously. This was the signal, and both monsters rushed forward, claws bared to attack. Their clash shook the ground, and the opponents struck each other an endless number of times. Drops of blood flew in every direction, but they didn't seem to notice the blows that could have brought down trees or the wounds that bled. The black lizard roared. The Wendigo's swift kick hit it right in the face. Victory was near, the Wendigo thought, until he realized that the lizard's claws were clinging to his wrist. It was not impossible to retreat, and the grip was dead. In a split second, when the Wendigo hesitated, the lizard struck the beast's head with its hand. The blow was so strong that the skull could not withstand it and cracked. And the body flew several meters in front, leaving the animal's arm in the lizard's clutches like a trophy. The lizard's body began to fly off Ananta as if in flames until he looked like a man. Slowly, the boy approached the mutilated body of his enemy. The beast began to decompose, and a black liquid flowed from the body of the beast, exposing the ribs. Then, the body of a white-haired girl appeared from the monster's carcass like a caterpillar cocoon. Having finally torn her out of the flesh that covered her, the boy grabbed the girl by the neck and lifted her off the ground. Straining his wrists, he began to slowly strangle her. The gleam in her blue eyes almost faded. Looking at her blue skin, the young man thought that perhaps she had been unconscious all this time while they were struggling. A strong wind suddenly picked up, and the boy concentrated on finding the cause of his uneasiness. Instinct told him that someone was watching him, but who? A whistle from the attack cut the silence, and the young man was unable to react to the enemy and was injured. Blood gushed from his right shoulder. The cut was not deep but noticeable. Turning around, the guy finally noticed the enemy. An abnormally large vulture was maneuvering in the air. All the greatness of which can be seen only when it spreads its powerful wings. The vulture descended to the ground and said, "You were a real god demon who devoured corpses. I have been watching you since you stepped on this earth." As he said these words, the vulture's feathers began to fall off until a middle-aged man appeared underneath. He had heterochromia, and his eyes were different colors. His cloak resembled bird wings, his clothes were covered with bird skulls and other similar symbols, and his collar was made of down. Before he could finish speaking, the body of the girl Ananta had dumped flew into his arms. The guy almost fell asleep while the old man was muttering to himself. At least that's what Ananta said. The young man was not interested in this conversation. The only thing he wanted was to kill his opponent. The old man began his animal transformation, this time growing arms for combat. At the same time, he boasted that his power allowed him to control spirits, and if he killed the lizard, he would get a much better one, better than some deer or wolf. It was no longer just a giant bird. This creature had arms, legs, and wings. Raising its wings, the beast said one word, "Phantom." An aura appeared around the bird, and it began to spread throughout the territory. From contact with it, every dead person, whether it was animals that had already died twice or people who had given their souls to God not long ago, began to rise, becoming part of the army of the dead. The beast shouted that Ananta would be torn apart. The barricade of corpses rushed at the young man. A few seconds later, the boy was being torn apart by wolves that had their fangs in Ananta's arms and legs. At this time, the dead soldiers stabbed the boy with their spears, inflicting a piercing wound to his stomach and chest. Seeing that the boy was not a threat, the vulture flew up to Ananta and dealt him the final blow with its clawed hand. "Let us hear your mournful cry," the vulture said. Pierced by the bird's claws, enduring the pain and abuse of the monster, the boy spat blood from his mouth and laughed. In an instant, everything was filled with a red glow, a pillar of aura rose above the boy, it twisted and divided until the mouths of various mystical creatures began to form. Toothy smiles appeared here and there and then disappeared in the flow of energy, and above them rose the head of a black dragon, which was much larger than the other mouths. And the center of all the chaos was Ananta. His body did not change into the body of a lizard, instead, he seemed to be covered with an armor of fire and darkness. He had a terrible smile on his face. It was clear that the slaughter and killing, his complete dominance over the enemy, brought him pleasure and happiness. The vulture was frightened, he had never seen such power before. It was too late for the vulture to escape, the dragon's head opened its mouth and charged at him. With one bite, the dragon bit off the bird's upper body and swallowed it. Blood flowed like a river from the bird's wounds and mouth, and only the torso and two wing branches remained, but the life did not leave the vulture. Horror, fear, and despair overwhelmed the vulture as it fell into the dragon's throat and saw hundreds of jaws, claws, and beaks coming at it. The creatures of fire and darkness took him into their arms. Tearing the stump of what had once been a mystical beast. The latter's suffering ended only when the monster grabbed the bird's head with its jaws and crushed its head. The blue eyes opened. The first thing the white-haired beauty saw was the darkness and fire clinging to the young man's body as if seeking refuge in it. She was mesmerized, unable to move or say a word. Lying on the ground, she watched the creepy creatures melt into thin air. Ananta, who was still shrouded in darkness, noticed her, and as he approached the girl, the remnants of the dragon's power almost completely disappeared. The young man said that the girl was free from the control of the demon god. The girl winced in pain. All she could remember was trying to reach for the shining wings. Her words worried Ananta. Are you also a victim of these wings? The girl could not understand Ananta's words. All she could do was ask who the boy was. The boy's answer stunned her. A descendant of the black dragon and a survivor. The devourer of all the demons of the gods of the world and the one who will destroy the incarnation of the wings. When she heard the main character's words, the girl lowered her gaze, which read incomprehension, confusion, and bewilderment. Sweat was dripping down her face, while her gaze seemed blank. After that, continuing to sit on the ground in front of the protagonist, she confusedly asked the one what he was talking about, adding that she didn't understand what he was saying. Not about the black dragon, nor about the incarnation of wings. While the girl was talking, the guy without any emotion on his face, continued to listen to her. Suddenly, the girl's eyes widened, and they were filled with confusion and incomprehension of what was happening. Then, in a confused voice saying that she was completely lost, she immediately lost consciousness and fell to the ground. As soon as the girl fell to the ground, the lizard sitting on the guy's shoulder hissed and looked at him as if asking what had happened to her. Ananta continued to look at the girl with his stern gaze, which almost never changed, and said that she was probably mentally tired of all the information he had given her. Then looking at the girl, who continued to lie unconscious, he thought about what he should do with her. At the same time the girl was in some space, which was painted in blood-red colors, splashing blood, which was covered with all the ground, was running somewhere. Images unknown to her began to appear in her mind, the first of which was a sign that looked like the wings of a dragon. Despair and fear was reflected on the girl's face, who continued to run in panic into the unknown, as if trying to escape from something. Suddenly another image surfaced in the girl's mind, which was the mystical creature she was turning into. It was covered in darkness and gloom, which instilled fear in the girl's heart. Feeling the gaze on her, the girl continued running and looked back, looking at the one who was chasing her with despair and fear in her eyes. The mystical creature that followed her was exactly what she had turned into not so long ago. With its massive feet on the blood-stained ground, it continued to follow her as if it was not going to let her go. Suddenly, the girl caught her foot on something and stumbled. Then, not even having the strength to put her hands in front of her to soften the blow, she fell face down on the ground, splashing the blood that covered the ground. Shivering with terror and fear, the girl struggled to rise. Her face as well as her clothes were completely covered in blood. With despair in her eyes she looked in front of her. Where in the pool of blood was a reflection, but not only her, and a terrifying mystical animal's small eyes, which frighteningly glowed bright blue light. Looking around, the girl realized that all this blood covering the ground was here for a reason. It belonged to the mountains of corpses that lay on either side of her. The whole thing was reminiscent of hell. The girl looked at her hands, which were completely covered in blood, with horror in her eyes. Shaking with fear and despair, she, breathing heavily in panic, tried to understand what was happening to her. But her thoughts were interrupted by a bright white light, which immediately dispersed the darkness that filled the space. This blindingly bright light belonged to a creature whose silhouette resembled an angel with two pairs of wings. The girl immediately turned around to see what had happened, as she had no idea where the light had come from. However, all she saw was someone's snow-white face with a smile on it. That smile was the last thing the girl saw, for the next moment she woke up and opened her eyes uncertainly, squinting against the bright daylight shining in her face. She was surprised to see a girl with pink hair staring at her, who greeted her with a smile on her face when she saw that she was awake. As it turned out, it was not just a girl, but a bunny girl, as a pair of cute long ears grew out of her head and a fluffy tail was visible behind her. Raising her hands to the top, she, glowing with happiness, said that it seemed to her that it was very painful in the dream, and that she had a nightmare. Hearing the bunny girl's words, the white-haired girl wondered if what she had seen was really a dream. However, she was interrupted by a man's voice. She turned around and saw a stern-looking guy, whom she had already seen before she had blacked out. He turned to his lizard and, calling her Ruby, ordered her to start. Turning to her master, she nodded in response. In the next moment, her eyes lit up with yellow light, while sparks of flame emerged from her mouth, which was also glowing. After which, a huge pillar of flame that was not quite the size of the lizard's body burst out from its mouth. The fire immediately began to consume a large pile of something, flaring up with even greater force. The silhouette of some creature appeared from the flames, its eyes shining with a bright light, as if it was trying to get out. But that was not to be, for the next moment, an even more intense torrent of flame consumed not only him but the other corpses as well. Ananta continued to stare at the flaming corpses with his usual scowl on his face. Once the flames subsided, the bunny girl with the same smile on her face announced that the monster that had been possessed by the demon was finally finished. But not everyone shared her joy and enthusiasm. The main character, with a fierce and cold expression on his face and exuding murderous intent, looked at the bunny girl. She saw his murderous gaze and with her usual smile praised him, saying that he had done a good job this time. But those words didn't stop Ananta, who the next moment grabbed the girl by the scruff of the neck, causing her to shriek. Then, lowering himself to her eye level, he angrily ordered her to shut up, calling her a garbage information provider, to which she giggled softly. Pointing at the white-haired girl sitting in bewilderment, he irritably added that her misinformation was costing him even more this time. Then, giving the girl a bunny slap, which made her fall to the floor with a shriek, he told her in an irritated voice that their deal was done, demanding that she pay him immediately. Rising to her feet and smiling, she told him not to get so angry over nothing. Then, turning to the white-haired girl, who was looking at her with wide-open eyes in bewilderment, obviously not understanding what was going on, she asked her if she could know her name. The girl answered in a not very friendly voice that her name was Nadia. Hearing this, the bunny girl excitedly replied that it was incredible and that she couldn't believe that there was another victim of the wings, just like Ananta. Nadia stared at the girl, wondering what she was talking about. But then the guy's voice interrupted their conversation, and with an annoyed look on his face, he shouted at the bunny girl and told her to stop talking. "What is this eternal hurry?" said the bunny girl with a smile on her face. Then she took out a gold mechanical watch on a chain, with a rabbit symbol engraved on the top. The girl and her watch looked a bit like the white rabbit from Alice in Wonderland. With a little effort, the bunny opened the lid, under which there was a strange mechanism. When it was activated, unexplained magical symbols appeared on the watch. In a minute, a huge abyss, both in diameter and depth, formed under the command, into which our heroes fell. Nadia could not hold back her scream of terror as she fell, flying headlong. She tried to somehow catch on to the edge, or at least soften her fall. Ananta was quite different, not a single muscle in his body or face moved, as if he didn't care about the unexpected trip at all. The crimson lizard clung to the guy's cloak out of habit. The only one who enjoyed the fall was the rabbit girl. Seeing that the ground was close, Nadia closed her eyes, expecting a collision with the ground. Nothing happened, and when she opened her eyes she saw that she was standing on her own 2 feet, even though she was flying upside down. The surprise of the magical landing replaced and eclipsed the surprise of what she saw. The titanic tree spread its branches in different directions, the radiance emanating from the top of the crown illuminating the area for kilometers around. And in the roots of the 100 was a rich and majestic city. Others stood nearby without showing any emotion. They probably come here often, the girl thought. The bunny turned to the confused girl, caught her hat with his hand and said the saying that a clever rabbit digs 3 holes at once. Then she added that she had forgotten to introduce herself and would fix it now. I'm from the largest information network on the continent, Rabbit's Foot, and I'm just a nice informant called Whitefoot, the girl said with her usual smile. Pointing to the guy, she added that they had been working together for a long time. Looking at the trunk of an ancient tree, the rabbit continued to talk about it. The tree was sacred, it was called the White Lotus Tree. The next thing she told us was about the city that surrounded the giant's roots. It turned out to be the largest trading city in the south. The White Paw wanted to add something else, but did not have time. Stop, the girls shout, stop the bunny. Nadia thanked him for rescuing her from the demon's control, but she was no longer able to listen to the Foot's monologues. The girl continued, if you want to continue the conversation, answer my question. Why did you bring me to this city? Shut up and follow me, I'll show you everything. With these words, Ananta silenced the girl. With an expression of complete indifference, he continued on his way. Entering one of the streets, the group found themselves at the city market. There were a lot of people and it was clear from their clothes that they lived in prosperity. The cobblestones that were laid everywhere and the white stone houses and walls confirmed this. After a while, Nadia broke the silence with a question. She wondered who the man was, the winged incarnation that Ananta was hunting for. The young man replied that he was a disgusting animal who thought he was a god. The girl was not satisfied with the boy's answer and wanted to hear more details. Then the Whitefoot intervened in the conversation, telling her that avatars received their human form and powers from the gods. The winged incarnations can also give power to others, but their powers are imperfect and it is not known whether it is a blessing or a curse. Imperfect, the girl asked again, clearly interested in the bunny's words. Unfortunately, the conversation could not continue. A harsh "we came" from the young man's mouth. The girl looked around and tensed up. She did not notice how Ananta had led them into a dark alley with people in chains everywhere. Men, women, and even children were chained and wooden shackled, their vendors glancing at the newcomers, sizing them up. Welcome to the cafe's slave market, said a Whitefoot. Recently, there have been more people here, the paw continued, not forgetting to show the girl the right way. She continued her story, immigrants, travelers, vagrants caught by slave hunters, and even animal spirits can all be found here. While listening to the bunny, Nadia looked around the market until her eyes were drawn to a majestic white tiger in a cage. As the group approached the massive door, Nadia looked at the Whitefoot and asked what this place had to do with the incarnation of wings. With one strong kick, Ananta sent her flying. Nadia's body curved and flew forcefully into the open door, after which it rolled down the stairs for some time. The girl did not immediately realize what had happened. Lying on the cold basement floor, she looked up and saw several people tied up. They looked exhausted and empty-eyed. Without understanding anything, she said, these people. Sacrifices, shouted Ananta from the doorway, sacrifices to the incarnation of wings. At the top of the sacred tree, sacrificial offerings are made. Rising above the green crown of the lotus tree, one could see the green leaves disappear. And instead hundreds of bodies with holes in them hang like garlands on the bare branches. Closing the door, the young man continued the conversation with his usual indifferent expression, you will be bait, like these people. So that we can catch the incarnation of wings. Nadia froze, and a cold sweat broke out on her skin as she saw the young man lock her prison and walk away. Ananta was in his usual gloomy mood, and when he left the dungeon, he told the bunny girl that the rest was up to her. She didn't mind at all and gladly agreed. But Nadia was not going to give up so easily and sit and wait for her fate. She made an attempt to learn more about her captors and climbed the steps to the door with the bars. She shouted loudly, wait, which attracted the attention of the bunny girl. Nadia clung to the bars in desperation and wondered if all these people imprisoned here were their work. The main character was quiet for a bit at first but then replied that even if it was, what was she going to do about it? The girl shouted in rage at him to stop being outrageous and answer her question. She tried to press his feelings of pity and conscience and said that using weak and innocent people as a way to achieve her goals is. But she had no time to finish her sentence when Ananta looked at her intently and asked if she felt any guilt at all. Then he turned to go on and lastly said that it was impossible to get revenge without getting your hands dirty. Nadia was shocked at such a heartless answer and didn't know what to even say to that. Seeing that he was leaving, she tugged the bars and told herself that she couldn't accept it. But the bunny girl remained by the door, and seeing her despair, she said that for her, it was all understandable. These poor people and even the children among all of them had already accepted their fate and did not resist. They suspected what awaited them, but they could not even imagine what terrible things they would have to endure at the hands of the incarnation of wings. And when she imagines all that awaits them, tears come to her eyes. However, saying all this, her words did not match her emotions, and it was as if she was laughing at the poor captive and mocking her. This made Nadia wrinkle her face in disgust. She didn't understand how such a cute creature on the outside could be so disgusting on the inside. Nadia answered her not to think that she could just taunt and use her as she pleased. But the bunny girl laughed and replied to her that that was exactly what Ananta said and she would have all the fun she wanted. After all, Nadia is here because of what she has done so far while under the control of the demon god and has caused a massacre that has killed many people dozens of times more than here in prison. And now it is very strange that she is worried about a few dozen lives. The girl who heard such accusations was horrified. But the bunny girl continued that even if it wasn't her intention and she wasn't in control, it didn't mean that these things never happened. Nadia's imagination conjured up horrible pictures of the piles of corpses and rivers of blood she was leaving behind. The bunny girl saw her desperation and anger and smiled. She touched her arm and advised her not to direct all her anger at her and Ananta, for they were not the reason she was here. It was all the fault of their common and identical enemy. The evil incarnation of wings. Who was atop a huge white lotus tree in the middle of the city, that's who was to be hated. The next day, our hero was sitting in the middle of a passage lined with stone bricks, where there were several warriors beside him preparing their weapons for battle. Ananta was also preparing for battle and checking his armor. A bunny girl approached him and confidently addressed him, saying that she thought he said something baseless. All those innocent victims had nothing to do with him. He ignored her assertion and asked what happened to that girl. The bunny girl replied that she had asked Nadia for her cooperation and everything was going according to plan. At the same time, there was a procession of captives in the middle of the city, led by guards more like priests in armor, white cloaks, and with spiky crowns on their heads. Nadia was among the captives, all of whom were about to be sacrificed. They were led to the White Lotus Temple and escorted by the wing guards themselves. Nadia looked up into the clear sky above her head that was displayed in her blue eyes and didn't know if this was the last time she would see it in her life. She was led along with the rest of the captives to a huge white temple that was located in the roots of a giant tree. This was part of their plan, or rather, the offering of the victim was the starting point of their plan to meet with the incarnation of wings. Along with this, they completed all the preparations to hunt down the incarnation of wings. There was a magical barrier around the White Lotus Temple that was impossible to pass through while it was active. However, during an arena battle that involved a sacrifice, the barrier would be removed for a short time. At that moment, the winner of the arena could touch the bark and break off a branch from the White Lotus tree, and it was a reward for the winner. After that, the incarnation of wings would soon descend to him to perform a ritual at the end of which the winner could receive the power of the beast or die in terrible agony. The bunny girl was optimistic about their plan, which, although sounding simple enough, was very complicated and bloody to execute. If only this guy had made up his mind from the beginning, they wouldn't have had to come up with this plan because he could have just attracted the attention of his enemy with indiscriminate massacre in the city. Even so, there was still a line that should never be crossed. She looked at Ananta, who was sharpening his axe with grim determination. And she thought, speaking of monsters, was he trying to draw a line between the dimensions of man and beast? The bunny girl knew a number of means and methods for doing so, but they were all quite controversial, and she knew our hero wouldn't agree to them. Ananta noticed her look and said that he could hear her rolling her eyes and knew what she was thinking and still wasn't going to act like the others. Then, picking up his axe, he noted that it hadn't been that long since their last meal, and now was just the perfect time for a post-meal workout. He headed towards the arena exit and told the girl and Ruby the lizard to sit quietly and watch from the sidelines. He turned around and added that this was his way, he only hunts beasts. The bunny girl pretended not to understand what he meant but asked him not to do anything to attract unnecessary attention. And while Ruby yawned, she added that extra attention would complicate things for them and anything could go wrong. Ananta replied firmly that he would take that into consideration. In the arena our hero was about to enter, the commander of one of the warrior squads shouted to his subordinates to form a wall of shields. Which they immediately did, putting up a palisade of spears in front of them. In front of them was a beast that looked like a giant leopard, only with a small head and a giant tail. Around it lay the corpses of the poor people who had hoped to defeat it. The beast let out a roar, hoping to scare the rest of the warriors and bring confusion to their ranks. But the squad leader shouted to them not to be afraid and to hold the line. However, we will never know whether they would have held their line or not because one of the warriors put a hand on his shoulder. And with force threw him back to the ground. He only had time to cry out in pain and surprise. It was our hero who entered the arena and removed the annoying obstacle from his path. The other warriors were shocked by the way he boldly stepped towards the monster and asked, "What the hell is he doing?" The beast, seeing the fresh and seemingly unintelligent victim, immediately lunged at it with a growl. It brought its large clawed paw up to strike. Ananta sliced through the beast's paw with one powerful blow. That's why its attack never reached its target. Everyone was shocked to see such a powerful blow. And the bunny girl realized that he had disobeyed her after all. She watched the hero's bloody display of strength and remarked to herself, "He's such a trouble." The warrior squad leader didn't understand how this was possible. He had considerable combat experience, but he had never met a warrior with such strength. How could an ordinary man overpower a mystical beast? The wounded beast could no longer move properly, much less attack. But Ananta was not going to give the beast a break and prepared for the next attack with his eyes burning with rage. After a moment, he had already jumped forward. He pushed off with enough force to fly above the beast and was about to deliver a crushing blow with two axes at once. His fierce blow hit the beast's head, knocking it to the ground. All the spectators froze in shock, and it was the first time they had ever seen someone defeat a mythical beast single-handedly and so quickly. Ananta pulled out his axe and the dead beast's carcass. And looked up and let out a fierce scream like some berserker. He looked up to the top of the tree, asking his enemy to just wait. And he would surely slice him into pieces and eat him alive soon. Meanwhile, despite the protagonist's threats, the top of the lotus tree was glowing with a white radiance. And at its foot, the procession with the prisoners went inside. Behind them, the gates immediately slammed shut with a thud. Nadia didn't like it. She felt as if she had entered a white and well-lit crypt rather than a temple. They were led down a brightly lit hallway with many pillars to a smaller tree. They were greeted by a loud voice that addressed the fear-filled citizens. Nadia tensed. This man was strangely familiar to her, and the mere thought of him instilled fear in her. The man, meanwhile, let go of the small bird that sat on his finger. And with a smile, he asked them to let go of their fear. He was saying welcome to them and greeting them in the temple of the goddess. He was surrounded by birds and dressed in a white and gold garment and seemed to have wings himself. Was he the ultimate evil and the incarnation of wings? The temple of the white lotus tree is surrounded by a barrier so strong that the place around it was nicknamed the sacred tree. For some unknown reason, all incarnations of wings settled there in search of offerings. Those who offered a sacrifice to the temple received the right to participate in the arena of Cepheus. Warriors who proved their strength in battle against beasts were rewarded with a branch of the white lotus tree. And those who are marked by the incarnation of wings are given a special power. Those who receive this power are called wing guardians. Let's go back to the time when Nadia was just locked in the cell with the rest of the people who were to act as victims. Standing at the cell door, Whitefoot was explaining to the girl their plan, which was to break through the incarnation of wings' defenses. And they planned to do so through infiltration under the pretense of sacrifice. Finished, she asked with a smile on her face if the girl had any more questions. Saying that it would be the last one, Nadia asked why Ananta wanted to kill the incarnation of wings, and was it something to do with his power? Whitefoot answered after a few seconds of silence that it wasn't that simple, and it would be impossible to explain in 2 words. However, she added that she could say one thing. A girl with pink hair, long ears and a hat on her head was standing in the middle of a ruined village that looked like hell. Namely, there was a creature called Death Incarnate. At this place was Whitefoot, whose usually cheerful face now lacked the usual smile. There was no emotion on her face, but her gaze was fixed on something. And that by its very nature boggled the imagination. In front of her was the boy who was little Ananta. Sitting on his knees in the middle of all this hell, he was screaming loudly and violently, holding someone's burnt corpse in his arms. Let us return from our memories to our time at the White Lotus Temple, where the same tall man with white hair and dressed in a stately robe, who greeted the people who had arrived as victims, addressing them in a majestic and present voice, urged them to raise their heads and accept salvation. The tired and more zombie-like people looked at the man with wide-open eyes that read surprise, fear and shock. Some of them folded their hands and cried out to God. At the same time, closing his eyes, the man in a majestic and present voice introduced himself as the saint whom everyone worships, for he is the owner of the white lotus tree, the incarnation of wings. Illuminated by a bright light like some deity, he introduced himself as Balzac el Genie. Nadia strained to listen to the continued speech of this pseudo-deity, who addressed the people who had become offerings to him. He was telling them to prepare to enter a world of liberation where there would be no more suffering and despair. However, it was clear from the faces of the captives that they were not enthusiastic about such a future. Balzac el Genie, with his manic smile, ended his speech with a call to entrust their bodies to the wings of salvation. It was amazing how different his seemingly kind words were from his intentions. But as soon as he fell silent, he was approached with a cry of despair by one of the captives, who tried to show all the respect she was capable of, shouting, "Oh, incarnation of wings." The girl fell to her knees and desperately begged him to show mercy and spare her little sister who was standing beside her. She looked at this monster in a beautiful wrapper and asked him to please spare her sister's life. The incarnation of wings seemed determined to grant her request and extended his hand with the words, "O good people, show devotion with noble hearts." The girl glowed with happiness, not believing her ears and eyes. Could it be that her sister would be saved? She looked gratefully at the hand extended to her. But just as she had time to say thank you, her head exploded, littering everything around her. There it was, the true bloodthirsty essence of wings incarnate. Her little sister was shocked and stared at the corpse in horror. Just a moment ago she thought she was saved, but now everything was lost, everything she loved. The other captives were horrified. They didn't fully understand what had happened or how the girl could die. Their faces were contorted with fear, horror and hatred. Nadia was furious, but there was absolutely nothing she could do now. She just had to wait a little longer. The incarnation of wings finally stopped playing his role as a noble priest and sat down on his throne made of tree roots and announced to everyone that in the face of death all are equal. He shifted one foot to the other and mundanely told the little girl that her sister was free from shame and pity. And soon she would reach nirvana. Balzac el Genie sat back on his throne and enjoyed the terror and despair on the faces of his captives. He had expected absolutely no resistance. But something began to happen in the crowd of captives. Nadia froze in place and began to attract the attention of the guards. They began to suspect something and began to draw their swords to deal with the strange prisoner. However, Nadia was not just standing there. A dark aura with tongues of dark flame began to emanate from her. She was transforming into her beast for revenge. And in a moment, a horrible Wendigo head with burning blue eyes appeared in front of the guards who had no time to do anything. The darkness emanating from the creature surrounded and grabbed the guards by the throat, leaving them no chance. The incarnation of the wings looked bored and did not even move from his throne. He noticed that she was not a savior. Nadia overheard his snarky remark and angrily answered him that she was a heartless killer. The currents of the dark tribe surrounded her and she was ready to end it all here and now. Balzac el Genie laughed at her and asked, "So there was an incarnation among the victims?" To him it was all amusing and nothing more. He felt absolutely no danger to himself. Nadia shouted, "Yggdrasil and Kernan," and began to transform into her monster, tearing the bonds that bound her. Deer antlers from the darkness appeared above her head and along with her long ears she was now very much like a wild deer. But something caught her attention during the transformation and she paused a little. She saw the frightened faces of the other captives who were screaming in terror, "Monster," and didn't immediately realize what had scared them so much. But as soon as she turned around and looked at her frightening shadow it all became clear to her. The frightening silhouette of her monster was indeed terrifying and frightening. It made her memory flash back to the past and the mountains of corpses with rivers of blood, all the results of her actions. Even if she didn't want to do such things, it didn't mean they didn't happen. But now she knew who was to blame and she was determined to get revenge on him. But her thoughts were interrupted by the voice of the wings incarnate, who ordered her not to resist, and as it turned out, it was hard enough not to obey him. A boy with white hair and a blank stare approached the younger sister of the dead girl and supported her, preventing her from falling. He then turned his gaze to Nadia, who also looked at the children with her black eyes. Suddenly her eyes turned a normal color and a warm smile appeared on her face, giving her a feeling of safety and calmness. In the next instant, hundreds of huge roots burst out of the ground, rushing towards the sky. This ability was named Yggdrasil. Some of the roots immediately grabbed tightly onto the nearby guards, who were bound and had no way to do anything. While the guards were dangling in the air, a large dome-shaped barrier made up of the same roots appeared around the group of people who were to become victims for the incarnation of wings, which was called SSS. Standing in front, and holding the staff that began to form from the roots, she turned to all the captives and said in a firm voice not to worry. Clenching her hand into a fist, she added in a determined voice that she would definitely protect them. However, in the next moment, her face took on a shocked, intense look. Because in the next second, a large beam of bright light struck the barrier that was in front of her, causing a loud explosion. Balzac Ilgini, who was the perpetrator of this attack, turned to the girl in a mocking voice and called her a cocky deer and told her to stop talking nonsense. After that, he asked in a cocky voice, "Does a nameless incarnation from a distant land dare to resist him?" The silhouette of a girl who held a staff in front of her began to emerge from the dust clouds that appeared after the incarnation's attack, and she told the guy that she actually had a name. "And my name is Nadia," said the girl in the same unwavering and dignified voice, who had a wreath of the same tree roots formed on her head, and then added in a firm voice that she was an incarnation of nature. The one who heard the girl's words replied in a mocking voice that she was foolish but quite brave. But the girl did not react in any way to the guy's mockery, but concentrated on her upcoming attack, once again beginning to manipulate the roots, which were eventually formed into a huge tree hammer, with a bright green light shining around it. This ability had the name Suchilus. While forming the hammer, the girl pondered whether the enemy's previous attack had been an invisible wave or telekinesis, as even though she was able to instinctively block it, she didn't feel threatened by it. But deciding that it didn't matter now, she focused on her attack, telling herself that she would crush Balzac Ilgini with all her strength. In the next second, with all her strength, she attacked the guy with the Suchilus hammer, which immediately flew towards him at a great speed. However, despite the seemingly enormous danger, he stood still and only grinned. The next moment, an iridescent aura in the shape of various wings formed around him, which resembled the tail of a peacock. The incarnation of wings extended his hand towards Nadia and ordered her to obey him. There was a loud and powerful explosion that was heard even in the arena, and Ananta stood over the defeated beast and raised his head to see where the noise was coming from. All the people in the stands fidgeted and asked each other what was wrong. Someone in the crowd said that the sound was coming from the white lotus tree, and everyone immediately raised their heads to look there. Even the warriors in the arena forgot about the battle and stared at the tree. Our protagonist knew roughly what was going on there, but he was as usual speechless. Meanwhile, inside the white lotus tree, Nadia was shocked by what she saw. She couldn't believe her strongest attack had been destroyed so easily by a single beam of light. She now realized that her enemy was on a whole other level, for in the face of her attack he didn't even move and continued to stare at her smugly. High at the top of the temple hung a huge golden cage, inside of which was darkness. From the noise below it began to shake. The incarnation of wings looked at the insolent prisoner who dared to defy him and asked if such a pitiful power was all she had. And after saying that, he snapped his fingers. The huge golden cage that hung from the ceiling fell to the ground with a loud clang, scattering dust and small stones. Nadia could barely stand on her feet from such a blow. She didn't realize what was happening, which showed very clearly on her face. The next second, however, when the dust cleared, her confusion was replaced by horror as she saw the creature that had broken free from its confinement. A huge shadow of which covered the terrified girl. She had never seen anything like it before. This monster had tattered wings with feathers and spikes, and they resembled more the wings of a pterodactyl than a bird. The captive boy shouted to her that it was dangerous, trying to warn her, but it was too late. The very next instant her eyes widened with pain and surprise. When she looked down at her body, she saw two large bone spikes that had hit her shoulder and the side of her stomach. The incarnation of wings with his sneaky smile advised her to be careful. Above him stood his hand monster at full height, the hideousness of which was hard to describe. The incarnation of wings continued his nonsense and urged her to serve Yo's loyal followers. It would seem that now, with such a monster at his side, no one would be able to stop him, and his bloodlust would continue to prosper. In the middle of the arena, where there used to be many spirit animals that fought with the challenged warriors, now there was not a single creature left that could stand on its feet. They were either dead or wounded. To the wounded white tiger, who was lying on the ground covered with wounds, came a guy with a blood-covered battle axe in his hands. The tiger roared angrily when he saw the guy and realized what he was about to do, but his face did not change in expression and his hard gaze remained the same. This guy was Ananta, who in his usual hard voice told the tiger that he could hate him. Then swinging his axe at the beast, he added that he should not, however, turn away in the face of death. The axe struck, accompanied by the sound of cutting flesh and blood splattering, which stained the sand of the arena red. One of the warriors watching the scene turned to the large tattooed man standing in front of him and calling him Duke Berngad. He said that everyone was extremely disturbed by the situation. Then pointing his finger at the warriors who were sitting on the ground, he added that it was clear to everyone that that guy was going to win. However, according to their plan, it was the Duke who should be the winner. At the same time, Ananta finished with the tiger, covered in blood. He stood in the middle of the arena with a gloomy look, waiting for the result. After a while, the announcer's voice sounded and announced in a loud voice that the black-haired guy standing in the middle of the arena was the winner. The audience applauded loudly, while the same warrior turned to Duke Berngard, asking what they should do now. The next moment several guards, dressed in masks and white robes, entered the arena, the first of whom solemnly carried a small chest before him. The announcer immediately turned to Ananta in a rapturous voice and said that the guardians of the wings would now bestow upon him a branch of white lotus. At the same time, a man of large build and tattoos replied to his subordinate that there was nothing to worry about as everything was going according to plan. Looking at the guy who was the winner and receiving the award, he added that in any case, the branch of the white lotus flower would still be in their hands. At the same time, Ananta looked at the branch held by one of the guardians without any emotion on his face. As he took the branch, his face became even more intimidating than usual, his eyes filled with hatred and a thirst for revenge. At the same time, at the White Lotus Temple, the floor of which was covered with roots. Sitting behind a barrier of roots, a white-haired boy and girl watched in horror at what was on the other side of the barrier. Nadia was kneeling there, bent over and breathing heavily, holding her wounded side, which was bleeding. In front of her, stood a huge bird-like monster, its eyes glowing red and emitting a terrifying aura. Balzac Ilgini turned to the wounded girl and said in a mocking voice that there was no point in protecting those victims at any cost. Then pointing at the frightened faces of the unfortunate people who should have been victims, he added with a smile that they should be relieved of their fear as soon as possible, and also bestowed with Yo's blessing. "Savior?" the girl asked in a cold voice. After which she said in a cold and angry voice not to make him repeat it twice. In the next moment, a black aura began to form around her again, which began to envelop her body. Saying that he was no savior, she said in a fierce voice that he was just a vile incarnation of a demon, bringing death and horror. Her horns were covered in a black aura, while her eyes shone even brighter at the contrast. Balzac Ilgini looked at the girl with a cold gaze. Then he replied that he would argue with her assertion. With a demonic smile, he stretched his hand forward and held out a finger, saying that true salvation was bestowed through despair. The next moment, tree roots began to emerge from the ground, which frightened the people behind the barrier. However, they didn't have time to realize anything, as the next moment, a root shot out from the ground and instantly pierced through the man's stomach. When Nadia heard the noise, she turned around, but what she saw made her pupils dilate with horror. All those people she had tried to protect by sheltering behind her barrier were now hanging in the air, being set upon by the huge roots. "No, don't," the girl screamed in panic. But it was too late. The next moment, more roots erupted from the ground around the bird-like monster and immediately headed towards it. After that, they stabbed into its skin, causing it to let out a roar. Balzac Ilgini standing in front of the monster and raising his hands to the sky, with a radiant smile on his face solemnly said, "May the blessing of the incarnation of wings illuminate this lost soul." With a mad smile, he added that she would be given a great honor. Immediately after his words, the roots of the white lotus tree on which the bodies were hanging were covered with red light that was pouring out of the corpses. Nadia looked at it with horror and bewilderment, not understanding what was happening, but realizing that it was obviously not good. As it turned out, the red light that had been sucked out of the bodies of the victims, flowing over the roots of the tree, went straight into the body of the monster. As she saw the light form into a horrifying-looking head, she realized what was happening. Balzac Ilgini confirmed her guesses, laughing madly saying that it was an infernal field where existence and non-existence coexisted. Unlike the immortal Nava, with a wave of his hand, he added that every man was inevitably doomed to die. The next moment, the barrier behind the girl collapsed. The roots along with the bodies began to fall to the ground. The guy who claimed to be a god continued, saying that he could only give meaning to their miserable existence. The roots that were wrapped around the guard sitting on the ground also began to glow red. Dropping the mask from one of the men, he told the girl to look. It was not a pretty sight, as the man's gnarled face and horrified eyes looked horrible. Balzac Ilgini continued his ramblings, in a solemn voice that had a hint of madness in it. He said that their meaningless lives would feed the white lotus tree. So they would be able to create an immortal warrior, while they would follow the cycle of life and be reborn by the light that would protect the white lotus tree. The ugly bird-like monster flapped its huge wings, emitting a piercing loud cry. While the incarnation enthusiastically exclaimed that this was the blessing of the wings. Hearing his words, Nadia, with a voice of contempt and anger, asked him what he was talking about, furiously asking how many human lives he had already consumed by adhering to his insane philosophy. He smiled with a wave of his hand. As a result, the roots of the tree burst out of the ground and surrounded the girl, preventing her from moving. Then, folding his arms in front of him, he replied that there were so many of them that he had lost count. Then passing by Nadia, he said that she was still a brave woman, if she continued to resist until the end. Turning his head, he asked her with a wry smile if she had anything to say. She grimaced in pain and anger and replied in a fierce voice, telling him to go to hell. When he heard her answer and grinned, he raised his hand with a smirk and said that it hurt him to see such a miserable end. But he had no time to do the deed, for the next moment the doors opened a little, and a red light came from behind them. Suddenly some black ball flew in. Balzac reacted instantly, attacking the object flying towards him in return. A hole immediately formed in the head of one of the guards, which was that ball. But as it turned out, it was just a decoy, followed by Ananta flying at the surprised Balzac Ilgini, holding a branch, his eyes filled with rage and glowing red. For some reason he couldn't move, his eyes wide open as he continued to watch the guy fly at him. The next moment, Ananta stabbed a white lotus branch right into Balzac's eye. Then he jumped back and landed some distance away from the guy who was still standing with the lotus branch in his eye. Seeing the main character, Nadia called out to him with hope in her voice. He turned around and was surprised that she was still alive, adding that he didn't know she was so lucky. At the same time, Balzac Ilgini, standing with a branch in his eye, finally spoke. Turning his head to Ananta, he asked in a horrified voice if he was the winner of the arena. He looked at the entrance, where the dead and bloody bodies of his guards lay, and could not believe his eyes, for he had never thought that someone like him could have gotten here. Ananta was angry at the incarnation's response, angrily asking what he was talking about. The next moment, however, he turned to the root-bound girl and asked her where the wings had gone, and why she was here with that screamer. His words confused the girl, as she couldn't understand what he was talking about. Ignoring her confusion, Ananta added that it wasn't enough to enter Yo's territory without permission. But the next moment his words were interrupted by Balzac, who, exuding murderous intent in a cold voice that made her heart sink, asked how he dared. Then with a face that was twisted with rage, he angrily shouted how he dared to insult the great Yo, the incarnation of wings, with his vile tongue. Then shouting angrily that he would rip it out of the boy's mouth, he applied his transformation, which caused his body to become covered with white feathers, while his hands turned into birds' feet. However, Ananta in a commanding voice, coldly told him to shut up. The next moment, time seemed to slow down. Then he angrily asked everyone in a furious voice, asking if they couldn't see that the person in front of them wasn't the incarnation of wings. At the same time, one of the guards swung his sword at someone. In the next second, he struck a blow. Unfortunately, it hit his helmet, which was knocked aside by the impact. His opponent, not missing the opportunity, quickly counterattacked, cutting the guard in two with his halberd. The man, who was covered in cuts and blood, was none other than Duke Bernhard, who stared steadfastly at the entrance to the White Lotus Temple. Turning to his warriors, he shouted at them to destroy all the guards who would interfere with them. In the next moment a real massacre began, with blood, heads and body parts flying from both sides. Watching it all from the side, Bernhard thought to himself that he was going to strike immediately after the barrier was removed to let the winner through, but to his surprise, the one who was supposed to be carrying the white lotus branch vanished. Cautiously looking around and holding his huge axe at the ready, he cautiously walked through the open doors, wondering if it could have been a trap. But what he saw inside shocked him. There were some kind of tree roots growing everywhere, with a few people eviscerated on them. The stairs leading upstairs were covered with dead bodies of guards and blood. What he saw made the man think that this was the work of that man, and by the way he was acting, it was obvious that he had not come to the incarnation of wings just to talk. Back inside the temple, there was silence between the three incarnations. The first to break it was Nadia, who looked at Balzac El Genie and asked Ananta what he meant when he said that he wasn't the incarnation of wings. Looking at the guy who called himself a wing incarnation, who was on the verge of throwing himself at them, she wondered if it was all a hoax. The protagonist irritatedly asked why she had eyes if she couldn't see basic things. Then he asked her if she'd ever wondered why he had such a big name, namely the incarnation of great wings. Nadia's mind immediately flashed back to the snow-white wings she had seen in her dream. Ananta continued, saying that his symbol was 3 pairs of white wings, with an eye in the center. Then pointing to Balzac, he asked the girl if she was the one she had called the incarnation. He added that the whole thing was a clown, since he couldn't even create wings like that. Turning to the guy who called himself an incarnation of wings, he said that if he was imitating him, he should try a little harder. He added that it wouldn't change the fact that he was just useless garbage with a too long tongue. After a moment's silence, Balzac, his eyes widened with rage, replied in a cold voice that he was talking nonsense and that his words made no sense at all. Then, with anger in his voice, he shouted to his guards to kill the boy. They instantly started to carry out the order. The hand of the protagonist began to cover the black aura, blazing with red flames, and as a result, formed into a large clawed paw, which in the next instant struck a blow. Surprisingly, it did not attack the opponents, but cut the roots that held Nadia. The next moment, she and the roots fell to the ground with a thud, emitting a painful groan. Ananta turned his back to the girl and asked her irritably why she was frozen. Nadia turned her gaze back to her shattered barrier. Under the rubble she was surprised to find a white-haired boy and a girl who had somehow managed to survive. Standing in front of a crowd of armed guards, who held their swords at the ready, the protagonist shouted to the girl to get away, which she did the next moment. One of the guards, with a dried-up face and red eyes, lunged at Ananta with a fierce shout. However, the clawed hand of the protagonist instantly destroyed him. At the same time, the bird-like ugly monster was watching all of this. But he wasn't going to stay away for long. The next moment, it opened its huge mouth, from which many sharp and large spikes appeared, which he immediately released directly into the place where the protagonist fought. Nadia reached the children, covering them with her body, fearfully tilted her head as low to the ground as possible. After a few moments, the dust caused by the monster's attack began to settle. As it turned out, Ananta, who had turned into a lizard and was hanging on the wall like a Spider-Man, managed to successfully dodge the attack. In the next second, with a lightning-fast push off the pillars, he rushed towards the bird-like monster at a tremendous speed. His hatred and rage was displayed in his every movement. At a tremendous speed, he flew into the monster while Balzac watched from the side. The monster managed to block the attack, causing the protagonist to retreat some distance. But even the safe distance was not so safe, because thanks to its huge size, it struck the place where Ananta was with its paw. But thanks to his good instincts, he managed to dodge without any problems. But he didn't just dodge. Concentrating his aura in his right hand, he jumped high into the air. After that, he hit the monster's head with a super powerful punch, causing the spot he hit to vaporize. The decapitated monster staggered backwards, leaning against the wall, while the protagonist jumped backwards. But in the next second, his instincts alerted him to the danger, causing him to look back. He didn't have time to do anything, however, as something came at him, knocking him to the ground. A bird's paw landed on Ananta's chest, pinning him to the ground. It was Balzac El Genie, who had waited for the right moment to take him by surprise. Turning to the protagonist lying on the ground, he said that he recognized that he was strong enough to even see the true power of the spirits. The next moment, rainbow wings reappeared behind him, with an eye in the center. Extending its claws toward Ananta, it said only one word, Padia. At the same moment, Nadia sensed something and turned around sharply in bewilderment. Seeing that ability for the second time, she realized how he had fended off her attack the first time. But in the next moment, something happened that no one could have expected. A large clawed paw suddenly intercepted Balzac's arm. The next thing he saw was the toothy maw of a humanoid lizard that threatened to devour him. But it was never meant to happen. As Balzac El Genie managed to intercept the protagonist's head with his second paw, He glared angrily at him, calling him an insolent cretin. But that Ananta was about to be surprised, and immediately raised his free paw. And in the next second he struck the place where the pretender was standing. But he managed to retreat, jumping back to a safe distance. The protagonist, driven by hatred and thirst to kill, grabbed the ground and immediately rushed after him. He attacked furiously, but his opponent managed to dodge all his attacks without much trouble. But Balzac Ilgini wasn't going to run away all the time. At one point he jumped back a greater distance than usual, causing Ananta to immediately rush after him. But that was exactly what the pretender, who had been trapping him all along, wanted, and a gloating grin appeared on his face. The next moment, he threw a punch that the protagonist, flying at full speed, was unable to block. One of the humanoid lizard's paws immediately separated from its body. And with it, he began to fall to the ground. But Ananta was not a man who could be defeated so easily. His eyes lit up with an even brighter red light, and then he let out a furious roar. Suddenly, a new arm instantly began to form in place of his severed arm. Balzac, who had landed on the ground, could not believe what he was seeing. Since his opponent was able to heal such a serious wound in the blink of an eye. Moreover, judging from his attitude, he had no intention of giving up. The next moment, an aura began to gather around the protagonist's outstretched arm, which he launched at his opponent with a wave of his hand. The red streak of the aura cut through the air, heading straight for Balzac. Balzac immediately weaved a few roots in front of him, intending to use them as a shield. But the shield made of roots was not very strong. The streak of red aura cut through the roots without any problems, continued its movement and hit the pretender, cutting him in two. As he felt the pain, he let out a heartbreaking scream, and then he continued to shout curses. Nadia was shocked by what she saw, wondering hopefully if it had worked. But even though half of his body was missing, Balzac was still alive. His previously white eyes were now bloodshot. He struggled to rise, leaning on his arm, moaning painfully, and asked in a furious voice how they had dared to do this to him. Ananta, who realized it wasn't over, stood alert, but the danger came from somewhere he didn't expect it. Behind him, a decapitated bird-like monster rose from the ground. The next thing he knew, he was lunging at the protagonist. Thanks to his instincts, Ananta managed to dodge the attack without any problems. However, when he turned his head, he realized that he was not the main target of that attack. Since they were now facing a real monster that consisted of the body of a bird-like monster while the upper part belonged to Balzac. They were so well matched that they seemed to be made for each other. But in all seriousness, the pretender now exuded a truly terrifying aura. But no matter how fearsome the opponent was, as experience had shown, that never stopped Ananta. A moment later, he disappeared from where he had just stood, leaving only dents in the ground behind him. With an enraged growl, he lunged at Balzac Ilgini while the latter shouted in an angry voice, "I'll show you the difference in strength, and how great the gulf between us is." The sun was shining brightly in the slightly cloudy blue sky. But the next moment, the silence was broken by a thumping sound that sounded like someone hitting glass. At the same time, a small crack appeared in the sky, as if it were something material. But just a moment later, the impact intensified, causing the crack to become even larger. The next moment, the sky, as if it were glass, shattered, its shards flying in all directions. From the resulting hole, a hand clad in a gilded massive glove appeared. In the hole created was a circle that resembled a portal, in which someone's silhouette could be seen. That silhouette turned out to be a majestic man who was dressed in gold and white armor, with a pair of small black horns growing out of his head while a golden semicircle hovered above his head. From a height that allowed him to see everything, he was looking at the city, and more specifically at a white lotus tree, in the center of which something was happening. At the same time in the White Lotus Temple, Balzac Ilgini majestically raised his arms and flapped his wings and said in a solemn voice for all to see his magnificent wings. He wanted to add something else. But Ananta didn't let him do so, as he instantly moved towards him and punched him in the stomach. He instantly bounced back, leaving his opponent writhing in pain. But despite the hole in his stomach, he didn't pay attention to it. Instead he raised his hand, which was glowing with golden light, upwards, gritting his teeth angrily. In the next moment, the roots that appeared from the ground instantly grabbed the protagonist's legs in an attempt to hold him down. At the same time, the hole inside its stomach surrounded by fangs opened even wider. In the next moment, countless white spikes emerged from it. Smirking with a gloating smile, Balzac turned to Ananta and told him that he would cut him to pieces. His words were not idle, as the next moment hundreds of spikes shot at great speed towards where the protagonist was standing. Seeing the approaching danger, he began to gather a red aura in his paws, turning blood red in color. A moment later, the spikes reached their target, creating a tremendous explosion. Seeing this, Nadia shouted the name of the protagonist in panic. But he was not the type to be destroyed by such an attack. And in the next moment, he jumped out of the dust cloud and was behind Balzac. He tried to turn around to repel the attack. But it was too late, as Ananta pushed off the ground with lightning speed. With a fierce roar and fists covered in a blood-red aura, he flew towards him. After catching up with his opponent, the protagonist began to furiously deliver crushing blows that colored everything around him in red tones. However, after delivering a series of blows, he immediately bounced back. Balzac, whose body had once been snow-white and majestic, was now black and ragged. He now looked more like some kind of ugly monster. Gritting his teeth angrily, he cursed the protagonist. However, when he looked at Ananta, who had landed and was standing some distance away, Balzac's red eyes widened in surprise. As he couldn't believe that his opponent's appearance had changed again. The one had become more massive and slightly larger, the claws on his paws had become larger while a red aura emanated from his feet. He wasn't the only one who noticed the change. Nadia, standing nearby watching the fight from the sidelines, was also shocked that Ananta's appearance had changed again. The roots were once again encircling the protagonist's legs, but this was no problem for him, as he just needed to chop off his legs. Once free of the roots, Ananta jumped high into the air. The severed legs immediately began to regrow at an incredible rate, and the next moment it was as if nothing had happened. As Balzac watched, he was increasingly amazed by the abilities of his opponent, who was so powerful that it was beyond human comprehension, and who also possessed incredible regeneration and transformation abilities. Realizing that he couldn't escape from such power, he decided to give his best. If he did, it would crush him faster than he could react. Raising his hand, which was shrouded in a golden aura, he clenched his teeth in an anger. The next moment, the ground began to shake as if an earthquake had started. Nadia cried out and fell back onto her hands, covering the children on the ground with her body. At the same time, to Ananta standing on the ground, what was rapidly approaching, it was moving underground, destroying the floor in its path. Upon seeing this, he instantly pushed off the ground and jumped into the air, while the roots rushed after him, intent on catching the enemy. However, their speed was clearly not enough to do so. Despite the number of roots and their rather high speed, the protagonist had no problem dodging them by jumping on the column. Turning his gaze to the one who was controlling the roots, Ananta said to himself that he couldn't go on like this for long. Since no matter how much he attacked, his opponent who had the white lotus branch could also recover. And the more the battle dragged on, the less favorable position he would be in. Suddenly, he shifted his gaze to the center of the temple, where corpses were falling from the top of the white lotus tree. They landed on a slightly smaller tree in the center of the temple before reaching the ground. Ananta immediately thought of a plan that he thought might work. Gathering the aura in his feet. The next instant he pushed himself off the ground with tremendous force. His actions puzzled not only Balzac, who didn't understand what he was going to do, but also Nadia, who opened her mouth in surprise. Ananta, however, continued to fly upwards at breakneck speed, while at the same time gathering an aura in his right hand. As it turned out, his target was the ceiling of the temple, which he struck the next instant. There was a loud explosion, which Balzac Ilgini watched with bewilderment as he stood on the ground, not understanding what his opponent was trying to accomplish. A round hole was formed in the ceiling, through which sunlight streamed in. The protagonist, along with the debris of the ceiling, began to fall down. Taking advantage of the fact that he couldn't dodge the attack in the air, Balzac successfully managed to tie up the protagonist with the knees of wood. Moving the immobilized Ananta in front of him, Balzac mockingly asked him if he was going to die under the debris of the ceiling. Or if he was just trying to think up some kind of ruse. There was arrogance and self-confidence in his gaze now, as he thought he could easily win now. How many? The protagonist said in a cold voice. How many lives have you taken? He asked the fake after a moment. To which the fake, covered in darkness and exuding a horrifying aura, replied that he was tired of counting, adding that he had absorbed so many that he had lost count. Hearing his reply, the protagonist sighed heavily. The atmosphere around him immediately turned purple in color. In the next instant, a pair of wings that glowed with a purple aura grew from his back. After which, Ananta said in a cold and majestic voice that in the name of the innocent lives he had devoured, he would be overthrown by the spirits of the dead. The atmosphere around him instantly changed, filled with the coldness of the dead. The lizard's eyes lit up with a violet light. In the next instant, the ceiling of the temple began to shake, and a noise was heard, as if hundreds of feet were running across the surface. Balzac Ilgini was perplexed and looked up, trying to realize what was happening. Fear stirred in his soul, caused by the unknown that awaited him. A few moments later, multiple bodies flew to the ground, their eyes glowing with a purple light. They were zombies controlled by Ananta. Adopting his will, they immediately rushed towards the fake, who continued to stand in bewilderment, not realizing what was happening. Dozens, if not hundreds of zombies rushed towards him, biting and tearing at his body while he frantically flailed his arms, trying to fight off the endless crowd of dead. His furious and frustrated screams could be heard everywhere. Watching this, Nadia again could not understand what was happening and why the dead suddenly came to life and started attacking Balzac. As a result, the zombies, due to their numbers, were able to surround him, starting to tear off chunks of flesh from him mercilessly. His painful and furious screams echoed around the neighborhood. As the dead continued to pile up from above, burying the fake underneath him more and more, he stretched his hand to the sky in despair and let out a heartbreaking cry. Gathering the last of his strength, he next moment burst out of the crowd of zombies that continued to follow him. With desperation in his voice, he rushed to the place where Nadia was sitting with her 2 children and started screaming in a frantic voice that he urgently needed a victim. Seeing Balzac approaching, who looked like a mad monster, Nadia got up from the ground and buried the children with her. Just when all seemed lost, a crack appeared in the sky. From which, in the next instant, a bright column of golden light began to fall directly on the maddened pretender. Having caught up with the monster, it burst with a bright light, from the force of which the girl had to cover her eyes with her hands. Squinting, she tried to see what had happened. In front of her, stood a man with a powerful physique and also clad in golden armor, his foot pressing Balzac's head to the ground. His entire appearance caused awe and admiration. Nadia froze with fear at the mere sight of him. She didn't know how she should react to run or fight when she saw him crouched in front of her. And without raising his head asked if you enjoyed the journey. Nadia was shocked by his words, for they didn't seem to be directed at her, but she was sure there was no one behind her. Nevertheless, there was some movement, and the sad-eyed boy she had so desperately, but not successfully, defended was getting to his feet. She turned around in horror and saw no more of the boy. There was a man with long white hair who was telling that strange warrior who had fallen from the heavens that he had overstayed his welcome a bit. It seems the boy was not what he seemed from the beginning and was spying on everything that was going on around him, but who had the power to do such a thing? The man tore off his clothes, which were clearly too small for him, and exposed his muscular torso. Then the strange warrior claimed that he had come to accompany him. It was now clear that this man was the real incarnation of the wings and he had finally come in person to deal with the fake. Meanwhile, Whitefoot was watching everything that was happening from a safe distance. She was looking up at the tree from above which cracks had formed in the sky. She was reporting the situation to someone from her information guild over the phone. There was a rift in space in the sky above the white lotus tree and it was definitely confirmed information. The ruby lizard was grinding its teeth with anger. Meanwhile, Whitefoot was saying that if Ananta-san was in the temple, he was most likely in a confrontation with his nemesis. It was indeed so. One of the servants or guards of the real incarnation of the wings landed on the floor of the temple. He was equipped in shiny golden armor. Whitefoot continued to report with a gloating and insidious smirk that this all meant that the incarnation of the wings itself was now in the city. In the temple itself, the real incarnation of the wings walked with a confident gait toward the landing place of his protector. He remotely resembled his counterfeit, but he looked completely different. He radiated confidence and inspired awe in everyone who looked at him. He seemed to know everything in the world and nothing could surprise him. When she saw him, Nadia thought her heart would jump out of her chest. It was more like a heart attack. She clutched her chest in terror. Her mind didn't remember, but she thought she knew this man. Watching his back, she thought, what? Who is this man? His silhouette refused to be familiar, but she couldn't remember where she had seen him before. The real incarnation of the wings walked at a leisurely pace toward his pathetic counterfeit, who was wedged between the stones and could only moan muffledly now. Balzac Ilgini's eyes widened in horror when he saw who approached him. The incarnation of Wings looked at him with contemptuous arrogance and asked what he was doing here. Balzac raised his bloody head and asked him how he could forget him so quickly. Especially after tearing the wings off his loyal servant. He reminded him that he had been a cruel master to him in the past. The incarnation of the Wings nonchalantly answered him that he had taken them away precisely because he deserved that punishment, all because he had allowed his desire for false glory to twist his mind. Then at his command his protector lifted the rest of Balzac's body, holding it by the neck. The man clenched his teeth together and groaned. As it turned out, there wasn't much left of him, but he was still alive. The incarnation of Wings reminded him that wings were a divine gift sent down to those who had originally been created to soar high in the clear sky. Balzac still didn't understand what he meant and grinned his toothy grin and asked what the hell was this nonsense. How dare he say that to him, the one who revered him more than anyone else and was his most loyal servant. The one who had sacrificed thousands, even tens of thousands of lives to create this perfect body. Someone who wanted his wings back at any cost. Balzac was desperate and furious. To this incarnation of Wings replied to him that he was stupid and didn't understand anything. Then he put his hand on the rest of his body. And then he also added that he felt sorry for him. In the next instant, the rest of Balzac's body lit up with a bright yellow glow. It crumbled into yellow dust, leaving behind nothing but a small branch of a white lotus tree. Meanwhile, under the pile of corpses of the former victims of the Wings incarnation, something was wrong. The eye that belonged to Ananta was watching the action from there, covered by all those corpses. And it all reminded him of something from the distant past. He remembered standing on the edge of a cliff at sunset with his teacher, who had told him he had a dream. A dream to find the edge of the earth where their world joined the world of the gods. The teacher convinced him that he would not stop until he reached his goal. Little Ananta had no idea how it would all turn out for him in the end. As it turned out, that teacher was the incarnation of Wings, and he was still young then, but even then he was as confident and determined as ever. He said that even if the world turned against him, he would sacrifice him to achieve his goal. Little Ananta looked up to his teacher with admiration, for he was an example and a hero to him. Then something happened that he could not even imagine. His home village was burned to the ground and smoke billowed above it. All the villagers died in the fire except him. Even his favorite sister, who had always been kind to him and always wished him only the best. She too perished in those flames. These painful memories made his eyes flash with rage. The Wings incarnation's protector stated that the white lotus tree had a strange name and seemed to be nothing more. It seems his dream had failed again. Wings incarnate agreed with him. He held a branch of the white lotus tree in his hand and said that it was a symbiosis of the power of the branches and the divine tree, and it was only a pitiful semblance, not even worthy of comparison with the world tree. Even so, he found something interesting and he turned his attention to Nadia. She was still holding on to her heart and could not get up. He walked closer to her and behind his back appeared the same two pairs of white shining wings. That's what the real appearance of the incarnation of Wings was like. But then suddenly there came a voice that told him that he had forgotten about a very curious connection. With those words, the clawed paw of a black lizard emerged from the pile of corpses. And then Ananta emerged in all his glory and fury, ready for battle with eyes blazing with hatred. He spread the full power of his claws to prepare his attack. He swung his claws and red arrows of energy flew towards his enemy. He didn't even seem to pay attention to the attack and didn't even turn towards it. However, the attack did not reach its target, but was blocked by an insurmountable obstacle in the form of the Wings incarnate's protector, who blocked the attack with his hand. Such a powerful attack left only a few scratches on his armor. Wings incarnation smugly smiled and began to turn around to his enemy and said that at last he had finally found him. Ananta roared in rage, ready at any moment to lash out at his enemy that he had hated for so long. He had waited for this opportunity for far too long and could take no more. With a growl he rushed to the attack, moving on 4 limbs at once. Only one defender separated him from this long-awaited revenge, and he was not going to stop in front of him. Ananta wanted to take him down with a single blow. Well, as soon as he got close to him he received a powerful blow to his toothy head. The blow was so powerful that it just blew off his entire head with a large part of the top of his torso. His head immediately began to regenerate back, burning with a red aura. The defender told him to tell him his name. But Ananta, whose head had already regenerated almost completely, only roared furiously in response. The defender was embarrassed by this response, but he did not hesitate and clenched his fist to gather energy for the next blow. He got into a fighting stance and said that talking didn't seem to help. Ananta roared again and rushed into the fight with fury. But this time he was ready for resistance, and dodged the defender's blow, then brought his fist down hard on his face. The incarnation of Wings, meanwhile, paid absolutely no attention to the fight that was going on behind his back. For some reason he was interested only in Nadia, who was looking at him with tension and could not move. He came closer and reached out his hand to touch her head. But he didn't succeed, for the next moment a bloody axe began to cleave the air. It didn't hit its target, but it nevertheless forced the incarnation of Wings to move away from Nadia. It was Lord Bernhard, the leader of the warriors, who delivered the blow. He was very surprised that the enemy was able to dodge such a sudden blow. Moreover, the incarnation of Wings had somehow managed to get behind him. He asked Bernhard that he would probably never give up, would he? He only answered him with a tense look of hatred. Lord Bernhard was an experienced warrior, but he didn't stand a chance against the incarnation of Wings. Nevertheless, he was not going to give up just like that and turned around to face his enemy. Behind him, Ananta and the Wings Incarnate's defender fought a desperate battle, each taking blow after blow, but their strength seemed to be equal. Their fight didn't stop for a second, each of them confident in their strength and ready to fight to the end. Watching what was happening behind the defender's back, Ananta warned him that he would tear him to pieces, as well as anyone who got in his way. And then he added that he would tear and kill them all. With each word, his scales grew red hotter and hotter, and his body seemed to grow larger with his rage. But the defender disagreed with him and with one powerful blow with a shout of Sparta sent him flying. But even such a powerful blow that destroyed most of the lizard's body didn't stop him. Moreover, it seemed that with each blow he received he stopped only more and his body was burning more and more bright red color, scales became tougher and bigger. Giant dark wings began to grow from his back. He let out another fierce roar, attracting the attention of everyone in the temple. Immediately everyone turned around and looked at what had once been Ananta in horror. Now in front of them was a giant black dragon that was blazing with its red fury. Only the incarnation of the Wings seemed to be not at all surprised by this transformation. And said with a smile that he finally saw a familiar face. Moreover, he knew this dragon very well, he even knew its name, it was called the Black Dragon Azidahaka. It was the incarnation of vengeance, anger and rage. But everything had to be paid for, and for this transformation Ananta paid with his sanity. He found himself in some desolate place high up in the mountain somewhere in the back of his mind. He looked around but he still didn't realize where he was. He had many questions he wanted to ask, but there was no one here to answer them. He didn't know what this place was or how he got here. Even the sky here was red and burning with fire, and Ananta thought this was bad and he should get out of here as soon as possible. He looked up and wondered where would he go next. But then a voice came from behind him and told him to remember. It was a huge black dragon standing in the middle of a lake of flames, telling him to remember who he was taking revenge on, who had taken everything from him and who he despised. Ananta recognized who it was and was horrified. It was the dragon Azidahaka himself. The dragon looked at him intently and told him that he was a cursed mortal. Then he brought his head even closer to our protagonist and told him that he was wallowing in regrets and was consumed by his blind rage. While Ananta was imprisoned on the edge of his consciousness, his body went into a berserk rage and began to crumble everything in front of him. And first in his path was the Wings Incarnation's protector, who barely had time to dodge his fierce blows that scattered rocks like dust. The defender realized that he could not resist the hail of such blows, so he retreated further away to take a short respite. He looked at the mad dragon and realized that he had lost his mind and had fallen into a berserk state. And now it seemed that nothing could stop him. The protector began to gather energy in his fist again, preparing a powerful attack. He said that someone who goes into a blind rage is a pitiful sight. His fists were burning with fire and he had a golden aura around him. In his dragon form, he had one special attack which was a deadly fire breath. And he used it without delay to crush his annoying enemy. Well, he was not wasting energy in his fist, he hoped to use his attack to repel the dragon's next attack. And when the dragon released a powerful stream of fire at him, he retaliated with a series of lightning-fast strikes to stop the flames. From the collision of their attacks, the flames spread throughout the temple. Wings Incarnate even had to cover himself with a wing to avoid being caught in the flames. Incarnate Wings turned to his opponent Lord Bernhard. He told him that he could have become a handful of ash in the blink of an eye, but he didn't budge, and because of that he respects him even though he is his enemy. Lord Bernhard indeed stood still and bravely withstood the torrents of flame without moving. He saw his chance in the enemy's delay and decided that now was the time to attack, and if he waited for his comrades he would miss it. So he rushed at his enemy without delay and shouted that he would fight to his last breath. He swung his axe and with a fierce cry was about to bring it down upon his enemy. But then his chest was cut by a thin beam of light. The incarnation of Wings moved forward with lightning speed, and a cut was formed on the warrior's chest, from which blood immediately gushed out. Immediately afterward, his axe and sling fell to the floor with a clatter. The incarnation of Wings said without emotion that this was the end for him. Well, as it turned out, the warrior was not so simple and with a growl started to turn into a beast, quickly healing his bloody wound. But just as he began to transform, the incarnation of Wings pierced him with another beam of light. Even for the beast, it was enough and he fell helplessly to the ground. The Wings incarnation only needed to point 2 fingers in its direction to do so. After dealing with the annoying foe, he walked over to Nadia and told her that she was shaking with fear. She still couldn't move and could only stare back at him hatefully. When he walked up to her, his 3 pairs of wings appeared behind his back. He told her that she wasn't what she used to be. Nadia finally remembered where she had seen him before. She had seen him the very day she lost consciousness and was captured by another animal essence. That very day she thought she had been sitting in the middle of a sea of blood and a white angel with 3 pairs of wings had appeared to her. But after that encounter, she remembered nothing. Meanwhile, the incarnation of the Wings said that the vibration of the branches proved that she too was a vessel chosen by the universal tree. Nadia did not understand what he was talking about and asked what branches, what was he talking about. But as it turned out, Nadia was not interested in him yet, and he went on to the corpse of the giant bird that used to sit in a cage and which was controlled by Balzac. Going to it, he explained that the branches are miracles beyond the limits of the human body and giving great power. In his hand he held the same shining branch that was left after Balzac's disappearance. He was going to insert it into the corpse of the beast. And as he put the branch into the wound, he said that his main desire was to reach the end of the earth, the same words he had spoken to Ananta many years before. Immediately afterward, the massive carcass of the ancient bird-like beast glowed with yellow lightning. Streams of bright yellow lightning filled the entire temple, and at their epicenter the giant carcass disappeared. In its place appeared a child that was still engulfed in small yellow lightning bolts. The incarnation of Wings immediately turned to him and told him that he was his brother, created by thousands of human lives and once caged. Then he asked him to tell him his name. Nadia watched all this with horror and amazement. She had never seen anything like this before. This boy had a manic smile and red eyes with pupils like a snake. He introduced himself that his name was Ziz. But all this action had no effect on the battle between Ananta and the Wings incarnation's protector. Their fight was in full swing. They exchanged blow after blow and neither of them wanted to concede. But in dragon form, the advantage was clearly on Ananta's side. And now even the powerful reinforced punches of the defender. He blocked them with no problem. And he was forced to retreat. But suddenly, instead of chasing him, the dragon let out a loud roar and prepared something else. The defender looked at him with incomprehension. Something was wrong here. As it turned out, the dragon was preparing to take off. He began to flap his huge red wings in preparation for a dash. And in the next instant, it soared through a hole in the ceiling. It flew high above the temple and hovered just above it. As the dust from the dragon's flight began to dissipate, Ziz was a little scared and looked at the dragon with anger, preparing to attack. The incarnation of Wings calmed him down and placing his hand on his head, he told him not to be afraid. But it seemed that fear was worth it, for the dragon began to form a giant ball of flame high in the sky. When it reached its maximum size, the dragon unleashed it directly at his enemies. This ball of flame was called the Jade Heaven Fire. The ball rushed towards the ruins of the temple with speed. It was so huge and flew so fast that it resembled a meteorite. The incarnation of Wings was not afraid of it at all. He raised his hand and asked how dare he look down on them. And adding that he had no place in the heavens, he began to gather streams of blue light in his hand. At the moment when the ball of flame was about to hit them, the incarnation of the Wings said, "Let there be light," and a bright flash of light illuminated the entire temple. This stream of light not only destroyed the flame ball, but flew straight into the dragon. After the beam of light hit the dragon, there was a very powerful and bright explosion that illuminated the entire top of the white lotus tree and the entire city around. It seemed that there was no trace of the dragon, only circles of black smoke. Whitefoot and Ruby watched the whole thing. The bunny girl tried to hold the lizard with all her might and told her superiors on the phone that it was all over. She reported in a sad voice that soon after the battle at the top of the white lotus tree, the tree itself had been destroyed by the forces of the wing incarnation. This was indeed true, and the top of the tree was engulfed in flames. Whitefoot continued his report and said that their trump card Vengeance Incarnate had been defeated. Ananta was now unconsciously falling from the sky, engulfed in smoke and remnants of the flames. But despite the rabbit girl's assumptions, Ananta still seemed to be alive, unconscious and hurtling toward the ground. Let's go back in time and discover the beginning of Ananta's story. As a young boy, Ananta grew up in a desolate area under the scorching sun, where not much grew and food was hard to find. Among the rocky terrain, only a few small areas of grass could be seen. Therefore, any movement in the desert attracted attention, especially when a pack of 4 hyena-like dogs chased after a small red lizard. The lizard ran with all its might, but there was no chance of escape as the dogs were catching up to it quite quickly. The first 2 of them sped up and were ready to attack. They had already opened their mouths to grab the poor lizard and end its torment. But suddenly a flying axe whizzed through the air. It hit one of the dogs in the forehead and it howled pitifully. Blood splattered in all directions. A foot immediately ran past the surprised lizard, whose owner shouted at the dogs to get away. It was Ananta, who was holding his other axe and was about to finish the dog off. The blood spurted again. And the dog fell dead under the gaze of his slumped pack. Ananta furiously let out the battle cry of his tribe. After which the other dogs fearfully began to whimper and run away. Ananta smugly looked after the fleeing hyena-like dogs, while the lizard looked at his savior with admiration. Ananta then tied up the dead dog and dragged it to the shade under a large rock, where he sat down hiding from the heat and wondering what he should do next. He propped his chin up with his hand while the lizard stayed near him and wagged its tail like a tame dog that wasn't going anywhere. The lizard's movements were starting to get on his nerves and he grudgingly asked why she was following him. And then she added that she was useless to him because she didn't even have meat, only bones. He started waving his hand trying to drive it away and asked why it didn't just want to get away. The lizard resentfully bounced a little farther away. And deep in her throat a fire began to ignite. And then it let out a stream of flame that nearly fried Ananta, who looked on in amazement at the whole thing and barely managed to dodge. Now he didn't think the lizard was so useless and asked how did she have flame breath. Is she really a descendant of dragons? The lizard turned away from him with a smug look showing her contempt for his stupidity. But then suddenly there was some movement behind Ananta's back, which alerted him. He turned around sharply to look at it, pouring sweat from worry. Something gigantic had come up behind him, right from where there was a rock behind which he was hiding from the sun. It turned out that it wasn't a rock at all, but a giant rhinoceros that had been resting there, and the lizard had woken him up with its flames. And now he woke up and was furious that these miserable little bugs had disturbed his sleep. His eyes that burned with anger focused on poor Ananta, who realized that now he had to get away quickly or he would be left with nothing but a flatbread. Ananta quickly grabbed the lizard and put it on his head and immediately started running with all his might, trying to escape the furious rhinoceros that was chasing him. He ran as fast as he could, not caring what road he was on as he approached the cliff, hoping that the rhinoceros would not want to chase him for so long and jump off the cliff. He barely made it to the edge and jumped off with a desperate cry. He landed on 2 feet at once and thought he was saved, but as it turned out there was someone else watching him, a man in a cloak. Ananta was surprised to see him, and asked himself why there was a man in the middle of the desert. But he had no time to find out, for the rhinoceros was not going anywhere, and furiously exhaling air from its nostrils was also preparing to jump. Ananta looked at him irritably and asked, "So you're not going to lag behind, are you?" Well, if that was the case, he was not going to run any further either. He set the lizard on the ground and it squeaked fearfully. Ananta got into a fighting stance and took out his axe, then he said to the rhino, "Go ahead and attack. I will show you the power of the air of the great black dragon," he said with confidence in his eyes. But suddenly this strange hooded man approached him, Ananta not knowing his intention turned towards him in terror. But the stranger did not do anything horrible, just took the hood off his head, putting his white hair under the rays of the bright sun, and looked confidently at the rhinoceros. The rhinoceros stared at him too, not about to back down. But when the stranger's eyes shone with a blue light, the rhinoceros immediately turned around and started running away in a hurried and frightened manner. Ananta then looked at the stranger curiously. It was the first time he had seen someone who could scare a stone rhinoceros with his mere appearance. The stranger looked at him with a smile and asked, "Boy, are you all right?" Ananta later recalled that that day, after meeting this stranger, his life changed. It changed forever. After that he brought his new teacher, as he introduced himself to him, to the village of their tribe, which was situated on the bank of a river so valuable in those parts. Their tribe was nomadic and periodically moved from place to place, getting food by gathering, hunting and fishing. The tribesmen greeted Ananta with joy, but were wary of his companion. One of them asked Ananta if he was still wandering around. Then they asked who was it that was walking beside them. Ananta replied that it was all right and it was an acquaintance of his who had helped him a lot. But immediately another voice was heard shouting his name, and the sound of which frightened Ananta very much. It was his sister, who was now running towards him and asking him where he had been missing for so long. Running up to him, she grabbed his cheeks and told him not to tell her that he was going to the spirit world alone again. If something happened to him, what would she do without him? Then she noticed the strange lizard on his head and asked him where the strange animal had come from and why he had brought it with him. Ananta simply replied that the lizard had followed him and that was all, he couldn't get rid of it. It was only then that she noticed the stranger who had come with her brother and asked who he was. Ananta introduced her to her teacher. He called him master and introduced his sister Ashita to him. His sister suddenly coughed and cold sweat covered her face. She coughed out black blood on her hand. Ananta immediately ran up to his sister and asked if she was all right. She told him not to worry and rather go with her to the house. But her look was not good. The stranger noticed all this and was quickly coming up with a plan how he could use this gullible boy. When Ananta and her sister left, the stranger was invited to the chief of the tribe to meet him and learn from him the purpose of his visit to the tribal lands. There he was immediately offered refreshments and invited to make himself comfortable. The tribal chief was pleased with the guest, for they do not often receive foreigners, so he told him that it would be disrespectful not to treat a guest who had helped a member of their tribe. He also told him that he could rest as long as he needed to continue his journey. The stranger introduced himself as Master Ryu and was grateful for their tribe's hospitality. As we see in the past incarnation of Wings was not embarrassed to call himself by other names and deceive gullible people. Wings incarnate looked at the lizard incredulously. She didn't have much sympathy for him either, as if knowing his true intentions. The Wings incarnate's eyes glowed bright blue again and the lizard hid frightened behind Ananta, who had already helped his sister and had come to listen to the conversation. The elder said that Ananta would show the guest around the neighborhood, which he was not at all happy about and asked why him. The warrior who was sitting near him put his hand on his head and advised him not to argue with the elder. But before letting the guest go, the chief had a few more questions for him. He wondered what had brought Master Ryu to such wild places where everywhere the land was broken and unfit for travel. The incarnation of Wings confidently replied that he was an explorer and was studying customs, locations, and incarnations from various regions. The chieftain did not fully understand what he was saying and asked again what kind of incarnations. The guest pulled a scroll out of his bag and offered him a look. Then he unfolded the map and explained that from the empire in the east to the glaciers in the far north through the deep forests of the west, he had traveled for many years collecting legends and traditions. He was particularly interested and fascinated by the tale of a deity that had been passed on in this wilderness by word of mouth for centuries. Ananta listened to his teacher fascinated, though he did not understand what he was talking about. But the elder and the older tribesmen suspected what he was talking about and asked him to specify which deity he was talking about. Incarnate Wings answered them and gave them a name that put them in awe, Azidahaka. He explained that this ancient black dragon had received the power of the gods and he was one of the 6 incarnations. He was called the greatest and strongest of all incarnations. He was treated with reverence and fear by all, and with terror behind his back. He was called the demonic incarnation, the black dragon Azidahaka. And at that moment, he was sleeping peacefully in one of the caves among the rocks near this village. A fire was burning brightly in the middle of the teepee, and something was cooking in a cauldron. Ashita held the bowl in her hands and looked at its contents with surprise and bewilderment. The white-haired man said that the black dragon was to blame, adding that what she drank was a healing herbal potion from Celestia's empire, which strengthened her immune system, restored her vitality, and filled her body with strength. Hearing this, Ananta exclaimed in surprise that it was great. After drinking the potion, the girl thanked Master Ryu with a happy smile on her face and said that she felt that she would feel much better today. Telling her not to overwork herself and to get more rest, the man headed for the exit and said he had to go. Hearing his words, the protagonist asked with interest where he was going today. The man replied that he was going downstream, as he needed to keep exploring further. Ananta immediately asked if he wanted to go fishing at the same time. When he heard a positive answer, he told his sister in a happy voice that he was going with the master and would be back soon. When he was about to leave, he was stopped by his sister's voice, causing him to turn around in confusion. Ashita smiled softly and wished him a happy journey, adding that he should return safely. He smiled widely and thanked her, and replied that he would be back soon. As he left the village, Ananta felt something and turned around. To his bewilderment, the people of his own village were giving him cold and gloomy looks. Not understanding what was going on and why everyone was looking at him like that, he continued on his way without giving it much thought. After a while, the protagonist and Master Ryu arrived at the river. After building a fire and roasting the fish they had caught, Ananta turned to the master and told him that he had been living in their village for a week. He asked how his research was going. He replied that he hadn't made much progress, but that he had learned some stories from the Black Dragon's heirs. Then he told them that in the past their ancestors had suffered from the invasions of neighboring tribes, but thanks to the help of the Black Dragon, they had successfully managed to defeat the invaders. In addition, all the inhabitants of the settlement were the heirs of warriors who had honored the Black Dragon as the savior of the tribe since ancient times. Looking at Ananta, who was munching on a fish and listening to his story with interest, he said that was all he had learned. Then, with a heavy sigh, he told the boy that the people of his village had avoided talking about the Black Dragon for some reason, as if they were hiding something. The boy replied that perhaps it just seemed that way to him, trying to cheer him up. Master Ryu turned to Ananta and asked him if he was still sneaking out to hunt in the wasteland. This question made him tense up. After pointing at his body, he added that he tried not to show it, but he noticed that he had recently received many small wounds, which his sister would soon notice as well. The protagonist, on the other hand, in an agitated voice asked the master not to tell his sister about it as he didn't want to worry her about nothing. Putting his hand on his chest, he said that winter would soon be upon them, and so they should make as much prey as they could. There was plenty of it in the wastelands. Then he told the man that they had no parents, as they had died of illness when they were young. His older sister had been too protective of him, and now he was just a child to her. Lowering his head, he added that she had always been very busy with daily chores as well as taking care of him, which made him think that he should at least hunt. Looking at the boy, the white-haired man asked if it was hard for him. He smiled brightly and replied that it wasn't hard at all, because it was all for his family. Saying that it was time to stop with the heavy topics, Ananta asked the man why he had started researching all these incarnations. Taking a fish from the fire, the man replied that he wanted to find divine revelations. Hearing this, the boy asked what that meant. He replied that these were the sources containing the sacred powers of the 6 incarnations, whose might surpasses all the laws of the world and is beyond human comprehension. He went on to say that the 6 incarnations had once been endowed with the powers of the gods, and if anyone managed to collect them. After a short pause, he added in a grim voice that person could become a being who could see far beyond this world. Hearing this, Ananta said in a surprised voice that his story was like the legend of the ancient scales. Hearing the boy's words, the man asked in shock what he was talking about. Ananta realized that he had said too much. The master was unusually interested and asked him what he knew about it. He scratched the back of his head and said that what he was going to tell him would have to be kept secret. He told the master that his sister had told him this story when he was a child. The story said that the Black Dragon, in a rage, after destroying the offenders of their people, did not stop there, and continued to kill and destroy everything in its path, until it turned all the western wastelands into ashes. In an effort to limit himself, the Black Dragon gave the scales to one of their ancestors, causing him to lose the source of his power and fall into a deep sleep. Then their ancestors erected a temple called the Dragon Gorge. There they placed the scales of the sleeping dragon and put the best warriors of the tribe to guard it, all to protect the scales of the Black Dragon from evil people. Hearing this, the man wanted to say something, but Ananta stopped him. He apologized and said that although he was his apprentice, he could not tell him more. There was a look of coldness on the man's face. The boy continued, saying that the elder had allowed him to stay with them for as long as he wanted, so if he decided to go anywhere else, he would be happy to take him there. Hearing this, the man replied that in that case there was a place he could take him. By sunset, they arrived at their destination. Running across the sand and making strange noises was Ruby. Was suddenly picked up by a hand. The owner of the hand was Ananta, who put the lizard on his shoulder and told him not to get discouraged, as they had already reached their destination. But suddenly his attention was drawn to something ahead of him. Ahead of him, his master stood on the edge of the cliff, gazing thoughtfully at the setting sun. Turning to the boy, he said that he had a dream. Beyond the border of this world he wanted to find the edge of the land that would connect their world to the world of the gods. Then turning his head, he said that until he fulfills this dream, he will not stop. Looking at the boy with a slight smile on his face, he added, "I won't stop even if the whole world turns against me." Ananta stared at the man with a bewildered look on his face, surprised. When he came to his senses, he asked him what he was talking about, and with a colder look he asked him if he hadn't already realized that his older sister's illness was actually caused by the Black Dragon's curse. At these words, the protagonist's eyes widened. Confused, he asked again what the man was talking about, to which he asked if he knew much about the dragon. The boy began to answer, saying that the one's name was Az Dagaka, he was a servant of the demon god, ruling over death and curses. Master Ryu immediately told the bewildered protagonist that the incarnation could not have served such a god for nothing. After all, could a god entrust divine revelation to mere mortals without reason? The lizard sitting on the protagonist's shoulder took on a threatening look, as if it didn't trust the man. The same continued, saying that the dragon was just using their tribe, he had passed on to them the curse of the demonic revelation that he himself had carried before. He looked down at Ananta with a smile and said that his parents had died for the same reason, and that his little sister was suffering from a terminal illness. Thinking back on it, the protagonist marveled at how the man then managed to convince him so easily. It's all because of the Black Dragon's curse. The boy's face grew dark. He believed it. As soon as he asked his master in an unsure voice if what he said was true, a smirk appeared on his face as he knew the boy had fallen into his trap. Reaching into his hiking bag and pulling out a flower that glowed white, he told the shocked Ananta that this sacred flower was to be donated to the sacred treasure that protected his tribe. Handing the flower to the boy, he added that once he did so, the dragon's curse would disappear, as would his sister's illness. When the boy looked away from the flower that could be his hope, he asked the master if he wanted him to break the rules of their village. He replied that he could only suggest it, while he had the choice to make. He added that even if the result was painful, the responsibility for that choice would be his alone. The night village slept deeply. Waking up in the middle of the night, Ashita opened her sleepy eyes. She looked at the place where her younger brother was supposed to be sleeping, but to her surprise he was not there. Pulling her cloak over herself, coughing, she walked out of the tent. Looking at the starry time, she anxiously wondered where he might have gone at this late hour. She added to herself that she hoped he wouldn't catch cold on such a cold night. At the same time, near the entrance of the temple, Dragon Canyon, 2 tall guards armed with spears stood guard at its entrance. Suddenly, something caught the attention of one of the guards. Seeing a figure approaching from one side of the canyon, the man stood in a fighting stance with his spear in front of him and told his companion that someone was coming. The man was none other than Master Ryu, who looked at the men who were shouting at him to stay back with a cold stare. Seeing that he continued to approach without intending to listen to them, one of the guards lunged at him with a shout, trying to impale the stranger with his spear. However, his spear could not reach its target, as he simply grabbed it by the tip. The guard's eyes widened in shock and horror at what he saw. The next moment, Master Ryu kicked the man's neck, causing his eyes to turn white. At the same time, the other guard, holding his spear in his hands, watched in horror as his comrade fell to the ground unconscious. The next moment he suffered a similar fate as the stranger slammed him into the wall with a single blow. The unconscious body of the second guard slowly sank to the ground. Turning back to where he had come from, he turned to the boy and told him he could come out. Ananta appeared from behind the rock, holding the flower carefully in his hand. He glanced at the unconscious guards on the ground and noted that his master was strong, for he could defeat 2 of the best warriors of the tribe with a single blow. He went inside and said that they should hurry up and finish what they had planned before dawn. Ananta followed him. At the next entrance, 2 torches were burning brightly to illuminate the interior. After walking down the corridor and disarming the rest of the guards, they reached a room, on the wall of which hung a red flag with the sign of a black dragon, and in the middle of the room was a chest covered with some ancient writings and images of dragons. In the next moment, Ananta looked confusedly at the flower, which seemed to start glowing even brighter. He asked his master excitedly what was going on, but he only chuckled. Then he told him that there was no need to be afraid, because everything was going according to plan. A wicked smile appeared on the white-haired man's face, which Ananta, who was standing behind him, was unfortunately unable to see. Removing the lid of a chest in the middle of the room, from which a bright golden light poured out, the protagonist and the man looked at its contents. Ananta stared at the scales with tension. As Master Ryu saw the item in the chest, which was made up of scales, and was surrounded by magical writings that glowed with golden light, he said that he had finally found the last piece. Looking at the artifact, he noticed a scale that was the only one that was turned upside down, which made it clear that this was the dragon's weakness. Turning to Ananta, who continued to hold the flower in his hands, the man thanked him for enlightening him, for it was only thanks to him that everything had happened. The same excitedly turned to his master and asked with hope in his voice, "Is his sister going to get well, because he did what he told him to do?" Then, in a voice trembling with excitement, he asked if there was any hope for them. But his hope was shattered the next moment. He put his hand on his shoulder and said in a cold voice that people like him were very stupid. Hearing this, the protagonist looked at the man with wide-open eyes and asked him what he was talking about. With a devilish smile on his face, he said in a cold voice that it was time to pay for his sins. Then he suddenly grabbed the boy's hands, which were holding the flower, pulling them towards the artifact. When Ananta saw this, he cried out in panic and asked what he was doing. He didn't answer, but simply brought the flower closer to the wrongly turned scales, causing them to glow with a bright golden light. The next moment the light turned white and engulfed the protagonist. A white pillar of light rose from the canyon straight into the sky. Seeing it, Ashita, who was standing outside and looking at the starry sky, she wondered if the pillar of light had come from the dragon's canyon. The next moment, however, a tremor shook the ground, causing her to cry out. At the same time, somewhere in one of the caves in the canyon, in the middle of the cave, a black dragon was sleeping on a flat space that looked like a nest. But in the very next second, its eyes opened. Rising up on his massive paws, he spread his huge red wings. In the next instant, the ground near the gorge shook. And out of it, leaving behind a puff of dust, a dragon flew like a black arrow into the starry night sky. The villagers who had been awakened by the earthquake and had already managed to rise from their tents were anxiously wondering what was happening. Suddenly, one of the men pointed his finger to the sky and fearfully told the others to look up. In the sky right above them, a huge black dragon was flying straight towards the white beam. As it flew toward its goal, the dragon wondered who was the unwise one who coveted the power of a god. Where the temple used to be, there was now only ruined rubble, in the midst of which Ruby was screaming in panic, trying to revive Ananta, who had lost both arms and now lay bloody on the ground in front of his pet. When he came to his senses, he gave a painful moan and turned his head to the lizard, who was looking at him with tears in his eyes. Shifting his gaze in front of him, he saw a silhouette that stood in front of a bright pillar of light that seemed to reach the heavens. That person was none other than his master Ryu, who with a smile on his face reached out his hand towards the pillar of light that levitated the flower that had transformed. Taking it in his hand, he said joyfully to himself that he finally had it in his hands. "Come, then, the miracle that transcends the limits of this world," he said. The next moment a light engulfed him. A moment later his clothes disappeared, and he looked in his pristine form with a smile at the flower, which glowed with a snow-white light. However, in the next moment, he grasped the flower with both hands and stabbed the sharp edge of the flower into his chest. The place where he stabbed the flower began to glow with a bright light. The next moment he spread his arms wide and let out a heartrending scream as white threads began to spread from that spot all over his body, connecting with the threads that were already present in his body. After a while, everything subsided and the beam of light disappeared, leaving behind only a white-haired man on one knee. In the next moment, a huge black dragon landed in front of him. The next moment he looked at the man with his red eyes and said with rage in his voice that he had touched the dragon's only weakness, and then asked him if he knew what it meant. The man looked at him with a relaxed gaze and nodded. The atmosphere around him completely changed, the aura he now emitted resembling a divine one. Introducing himself as Az Dagaka, the dragon told the man to say his name. In the next moment, a white barrier formed around his body, as if some kind of transformation was taking place. A moment later, a clear soft voice sounded, accompanied by the appearance of snow-white wings, as well as the complete transformation of the man, who said that his name was Gyo. I am the incarnation of wings. The creature that appeared in front of the dragon had the body of a bird with an eye in the middle, as well as 3 pairs of large snow-white wings. Its head resembled a dragon's head, with a halo of stars shining above it in a semicircle. It was a creature that was truly awe-inspiring to everyone who looked at it. The wind created by the wings of this majestic-looking creature kicked up dust, causing Ananta, who was lying on the ground, to lower his head to the ground. He groaned in pain and raised his head, wondering what had happened. In front of him, at some distance, a huge black dragon was sitting on the ground, staring with its red eyes at some snow-white angel-like creature that was floating in the sky above him. The dragon looked angrily at Gyo, who was floating in the sky, and said that he sensed that the treasures of the gods were hidden in his body. Then adding that it was impossible, as even the incarnation was not able to combine them all in one body. With a wicked squint of his eyes, he asked him what he had done to the real owners of the treasures. To which he replied that he shouldn't ask such obvious things. For he must have known that he had killed them all and taken their revelations. Then spreading his snow-white wings, he formed 6 spheres of light, which in the next instant were aimed straight at Az Dagak. Once they hit him, the spheres exploded and created an explosion that caused a cloud of dust to gather around the place for a few seconds. As soon as the dust cleared, the unharmed dragon appeared behind it, successfully blocking the attack with its wing. Turning to him, Gyo said that he had willingly given up his own, which was why he was so visibly weakened. He then arrogantly said that he had only become a ghost of the divine era, adding that he would personally crush him. Az Dagak's eyes shone with an even stronger red light, while a bright yellow light began to appear in his mouth. Try it if you have the strength, he said, releasing a huge fire attack from his mouth, aimed at the incarnation of wings. However, he was able to dodge the attack without any problems, flying away. Az Dagaka immediately lifted himself off the ground and flew into the air, and then rushed in pursuit at breakneck speed. Gyo retreated and flew higher and higher into the sky. Seeing this, the dragon immediately formed many magic circles and fireballs appeared on them. The next moment, they like a rain of fire flew straight to the embodiment of wings, which stopped running, turned around to repel the attack. A ball of bright white light began to form in front of him. After his words, "Let there be light," he created an explosion that instantly destroyed all the fireballs flying at him. Such a turn did not surprise the dragon, as he realized that such an opponent could not be defeated so easily. Suddenly everything around him was colored in blood-red tones, and black-red fire appeared around the dragon. The next moment after flapping its wings, it was heading towards Gyo. But Gyo had no intention of running away or dodging. Hovering in place, he opened his wings wide. In the next moment, he flapped them forcefully, sending a multitude of snow-white streaks of light at Az Dagak, which, after colliding with the dragon's attacks, destroyed them. But they didn't stop there, they headed straight for the dragon. The next moment there was a huge explosion that created a small star in the night sky, shining brightly and illuminating everything around. But in the next instant it turned into a huge white ball. The villagers who had come out into the outside watched the scene with fear and trepidation. "Ananta!" murmured Ashita with worry in her voice, looking at the huge white ball in the sky. The same at this time spitting out blood from his mouth and enduring excruciating pain, with a pained tone he stood up. Kneeling down and breathing heavily, he stared at the ground. Raising his head and looking towards the village where his sister was supposed to be, he mumbled her name in a worried and anxious voice. At the same time, the defeated dragon fell to the ground with a loud crash, raising a huge cloud of dust on impact. Az Dagak's huge but barely alive and wounded body lay motionless on the ground. While in the sky, Gyo, who had taken on a slightly more human form, was floating in the sky, looking at his defeated opponent with a haughty look. Grinning haughtily, he turned to the dragon who was already on the verge of death. He said that he had torn his heart out. "You have lost to Az Dagaka." Whereupon he chuckled happily. Raising his head up and looking at the beautiful starry sky, he said in a dreamy voice that he would finally reach the heavens. The next moment, turning into a snow-white beam of light, he soared even higher into the sky. Looking at it with a shocked and broken look, with tears in his eyes, Ananta wondered how this was possible and why it happened. After all, he had just done it for his sister. Suddenly the main character's thoughts were interrupted by someone's voice. Turning around, he saw a black dragon lying on the ground. He said in a weak voice that it was now clear to him how the incarnation of Wings managed to pull it all off, because he was helped not by anyone else, but by those to whom he entrusted his secret and weakness. On hearing this, Ananta, with tears streaming down his face, in an apologetic and pitiful voice started begging the dragon to forgive him as he was doing it for his sister. "What a pity, now the demon god has to die with regrets," Az Dagaka said. The next moment, his body glowed with a blood-red light, followed by a cold and fierce voice saying that he would not forgive him. "I curse you," he said, after which his body faded and began to disintegrate. The very next moment, however, everything turned blood-red again. And from the dead body burst forth a terrifying dragon spirit, which raised its head and uttered a shrill roar. Ananta, who was sitting on the ground, watched as it completely emerged from the dead body. Horror was reflected on his face, for even he knew that he was a demon god. The dragon blazed with fire and soared into the sky. But the realization of where it was going made Ananta feel cold inside. His eyes widened in horror as it flew toward his village. In a few moments the dragon flew towards the village, where the villagers stood in the street and stared at him with fear and bewilderment. However, the dragon did not come to these people to make a commission or agreement. This time he had only one purpose: to kill and destroy. To wipe out those to whom he had entrusted his life and who had failed to preserve it. The next moment, a sea of fire rained down on the village, turning it into a hell. From everywhere came the dying and painful screams of people burning alive. Ashita was no exception, and she was consumed by the fire like everyone else. In an instant, an entire village was wiped out. "No. No. Sis," still not believing what was happening, shouted Ananta. His eyes were widened with horror while tears were streaming from his eyes. He wanted to rush to his sister, to find her and help her, but... The next moment a huge dragon head appeared in front of him, which opened its blood-red maw at a great speed, approaching him intending to swallow him. A moment later, the dragon's remaining power descended upon the protagonist. He was immediately engulfed in red-black flames, causing his eyes to glow white. This flame began to penetrate every cell of his body, reaching his heart. It colored it blood-black. His hands began to regenerate, while his face looked more like that of a demon than a human. His body began to grow flames, and less resembled a human body. The next moment it formed into a dragon, which opened its maw and let out a loud roar. Az Dagaka, who was disappearing and dissolving into nothingness, said to Ananta, who had already finally turned into a dragon, that he would now be forever surrounded only by death and destruction. These were the dragon's last words, after which silence reigned. Under the starry sky, in the midst of the devastation, Ananta, who had received the dragon's curse, sat alone in the world and had to bear the responsibility for his choices. A lone torch hanging on the wall illuminated the corridor of the dungeon, as well as the door of the cell, where our protagonist kneeled with his head in chains. The hatred in and lust for revenge in his eyes was not about to disappear. After Ananta was defeated and helplessly falling approaching the ground, the incarnation of Wings along with Ziz looked at his falling body engulfed in black smoke. He commented on all this, saying that Ananta had traveled a long and winding road. He got what he wanted and wasn't going to linger here any longer, so he said it was time for them to go back, leaving a shocked Nadia behind. They were all going to return to their sanctuary together. For this the guardian of the Wing incarnation was once again about to open the portal, tearing the very fabric of space. With a few of his blows the space in front of him shattered like glass, revealing an endless void in front of them. But before they could pass through the portal, the Wings incarnation's attention was stopped by a voice. Ziz even turned around to see who dared to speak to the Wing incarnation. It was Nadia, who said that Ananta had told her that the Wing incarnation was a vile creature who thought he was a god, but that the child next to him was also a true incarnation. She asked for an answer. After all, she couldn't remember anything now until she met the wing incarnation in the past. Nadia wanted to know if this child could be one of the 6 true incarnations. But the wing's incarnation didn't answer her directly, only smiling remembered the name of the boy he had abused in the past. And said that Ananta was actually that boy from the past. He was not going to linger here and explain everything to her, so he headed to his portal and said goodbye, that everything in this world is just a combination of cause and effect, and when that connection is broken everything disappears. He smiled one last time and added that this is what is called fate. He looked at the tense Nadia and, calling her the embodiment of nature, said that he looked forward to their next meeting, and after a moment he and his companions disappeared into the portal. Nadia was left alone, not knowing what to do next and trying to come to her senses. A few weeks after these incidents, and somewhere deep in the mountains of the northwest, a lone figure with long red hair was taking a bath in the middle of a huge cave. 2 girls approached her and addressed her, "Your Majesty." They were 2 battle-hardened warriors, and they had news for their ruler. They reported that news had come that Lord Bernhard was returning from the southern frontiers. The ruler began to rise and said that this was the best news he had heard in days. Coming out of the water, he turned to the girl who had brought him the news and said that she was lucky, because if she had brought bad news she would have gotten a slap on the wrist. She couldn't agree more, she was lucky indeed. They all knew their ruler's temper. Another female warrior immediately put a robe on him. The ruler asked who he was returning with, not the incarnation of the wings by any chance. The girl answered that according to the messenger's words, 1 incarnation and 2 people were going with them. And it was unknown exactly what kind of incarnation it was. As it turned out, the ruler was a woman, a very muscular woman. And when she heard the answer of her subordinates she smiled and said that as always it would be better to see everything with her own eyes and draw conclusions herself. The fortress looked imposing, secure and impregnable. It was built right in the mountains, and it adjoined them, using their natural landscape for its defense. And right now a group of several travelers who had finally reached their goal were entering its huge gates. Among them was Nadia and Lord Bernhard. Nadia walked beside the lord and thought about her companion. To her, he was really like Ananta, for as much as he too had a personal score to settle with the incarnation of wings. She was here now because when the wing incarnation had left through the portal, Lord Bernhard and his warriors had approached her and, after introducing themselves, invited her to the headquarters of the organization he served. At first glance it might seem that the reason she was invited was because of the battle and her participation in it, but in fact the only thing he was interested in was the power Ananta possessed. Who, by the way, had survived the defeat and was captured by Bernhard's warriors. But there was another interesting thing. As soon as the fight was over, Whitefoot disappeared without a trace and Nadia never saw her again. So in essence Nadia could have gone anywhere and no one would have pursued her, but she decided to go to the northwest of the continent to meet the head of the organization to which Lord Bernhard belonged. Absorbed in her thoughts she did not notice that they were led straight to the throne room and the doors were opened in front of them. The herald announced in a loud voice that Lord and Duke Bernhard had arrived. A spacious room in Nordic style came into view. In the middle of it was a red carpet with warriors lined up on either side of it. From their appearance, one could tell that not all of them were 100% human, and some of them were also incarnations. Some of them stared at Nadia incredulously. The others paid absolutely no attention to her. She and Lord Bernhard stood beside them. Immediately after them, the herald announced the arrival of Her Majesty the Queen. Nadia watched her every step carefully. She recalled what she had heard about her on the way here. The queen was the first princess of the Mangak Valkyries of the warrior race and she was actively opposed to the incarnation of the wings. Her name was Ragelsa Einherjar, leader of the Levitian. She immediately sat down on her throne and announced with a smile that the queen had arrived. Before her, Nadia and Lord Bernhard came to the reception. The queen greeted them and said she was glad they had finally arrived. She cheerfully asked him to skip all formalities and go straight to the results of the expedition. Bernhard immediately began to report the results. According to their plan to reach the temple at Caves, they had killed a group of gladiators in the arena and provided themselves with cover. They had some unforeseen circumstances along the way, but eventually they managed to get into the temple. It was there that he encountered the incarnation of Gyoyo's wings. Hearing his words, some of the warriors froze in surprise. The queen was eager to hear what happened next, so she hurried him on. Bernhard sadly continued that immediately afterward he engaged him in battle, but to his shame he lost. The queen did not like what she heard and asked him how he dared to return home in disgrace and without information. Bernhardt's face was grim, but he replied that defeat as well as victories are part of a warrior's life, and their number does not matter. And with a forceful clenching of his fists he added that in the end he would surely kill him with his own hands. His answer pleased the queen. And she laughed and said, that's right, now she would definitely recognize her faithful Bernhardt. But now, more importantly, she wondered what incarnation was beside him. Bernhardt apologized for not introducing her sooner and said that it was Nadia, the incarnation of nature, and she was part of another group, also pursuing the incarnation of wings. After telling the queen a bit about her, he stated that she was their new ally and agreed to help them. So he brought her here and introduced her to the queen as a thank for the help she had given them during the expedition, especially for nursing his wounds. But someone was missing, and the queen asked her the rest of the group she had been told about in the report was. The warrior replied that those could hardly be called members of the group, as they were just a wounded male savage and a little girl who had offered them cooperation in return for their treatment and protection. The little girl herself is fine and they will give her to a foster family later. But the male savage is lying unconscious in the infirmary, his condition is extremely serious and he is badly mutilated. The warrior said that if the queen wanted, they could bring him here by force. But she said not to. Queen Ragelsa walked right up to Nadia and told her welcome. And then held out her muscular hand to introduce herself, introducing herself as Ragelsa Einherjar. Nadia shook her hand and thanked her for the warm welcome. But the queen was in no hurry to let go of her hand and asked what she expected from the cooperation with Levitian. Nadia was taken by surprise by this question. Seeing her confusion, the queen warned her that if she was an infiltrated spy, she wanted to know about it immediately. Nadia said that she wanted to know everything about the tree branch that was embedded in her body. But as soon as she said that, someone from the audience shouted out the queen's name. One of the female warriors, who looked like a werewolf, shouted furiously to the queen not to listen to the stranger's tales. She could smell the stench of wings right from here. She immediately pointed her finger at Nadia, asking if she really had the branch she had received from the winged one inside her. One of the horned warriors gave her a disgruntled look. Nadia was silent, not knowing what to say, and then the queen asked if it was true. Nadia answered that yes, it was true, and she could still feel the branch resonating inside her after the meeting with the winged incarnation. But after that she added that despite all that, she knows absolutely nothing about it. The queen asked Bernhard if he was the one who told the girl about the branch. But the man replied that he had no right to share any information without her consent. The queen looked closely at Nadia. If she was the one the wing incarnation was looking for, then this was an extremely good chance for them. However, a frightened warrior suddenly burst into the hall and addressed Her Majesty directly. The queen was angered by this behavior and asked why the devil she had barged into the hall during a royal meeting. The warrior apologized and said that the matter was extremely urgent. For right now a demon had awakened in one of the peaceful areas with citizens. It was Ananta who woke up and went into a rage and then began to destroy everything around him. There was a merciless massacre. So what could have made Ananta go on a rampage and start destroying everything? Let's go back to the beginning of Ananta's story, to the very night when the incarnation of wings took everything from him, everything he held dear. After the destruction of the village, Azitahaka's dragon curse began to weaken a bit and Ananta began to regain control of his body. He was still in the form of a horrible lizard blazing with black fire, but he was no longer in dragon form. Pain and rage filled him and there was nothing he could do about it. He realized that he was beginning to lose himself and that his consciousness was slipping away from him. Ananta was one step away from becoming such a monster forever, losing his self. He needed something to remind him of who he was. The monster he had become turned his ugly head towards the burning village. When he saw it, he realized that something terrible had happened and everything else faded into the background for him. He was finally able to control this beast and stepped first one tentative step. Then another. And then he ran straight on 4 limbs toward the village. He ran really fast, leaving only a trail of black and red aura behind him. He ran as if his life depended on it and he could change and fix something else. But as he reached the edge of the burning village, he roared in despair and his scream filled the surrounding valley. It was a scream of despair, rage and pain. Ananta's eyes widened and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Everything he loved, his native village where he grew up and lived his entire life, was engulfed in merciless flames and many charred corpses lay around. Seeing all this, Ananta regained full control of his body and mind, and the curse began to recede from him little by little. His horrible burning shell began to vaporize. And Ananta took the first tentative step. Next, he was completely free of the remnants of the curse and headed forward. Now he was only interested in one thing, or rather only one person. The hands he had lost had now recovered and were burning with the same black-red aura. He approached one of the burned corpses in desperation. It was his beloved sister whom he had wanted so badly to help, but he had made things worse many times over. Ananta leaned over the corpse, drenching himself in tears and not knowing what to say. He had lost so much in one day, and all because of his stupidity. Looking at her burnt corpse, the only words he could squeeze out were to wish her peace and a happy journey in the other world. But then he ran out of words and his eyes filled with bloody tears. Ananta started screaming desperately and lifted the burnt corpse in his arms. He bent over it tremblingly. Once again he could not hold back his desperate and heart-rending cry as streams of bloody tears flowed unceasingly down his face. All this was watched by the White Foot, and she heard the desperate promises of Ananta, who threatened the incarnation of the wings that he would kill him himself with his own hands, and he swore to it. Ananta, with all the anger of which he was capable, shouted, "Gyuyo," hoping that his desperate cry would reach the heavens and be heard by his assailant. Ananta had remembered this countless times already and woke up from this nightmare, but even so his eyes were still filled with tears. He was all bandaged up and lying on the bed. He found himself in the middle of an unfamiliar house and wondered what this place was. It turned out that all this time there had been a little girl with big ears like a desert mouse beside him near the bed. She said an incomprehensible phrase, "Kokanin," and stared rapturously at our hero. Ananta looked at her carefully and did not realize at once what kind of creature she was. But such cuteness frightened him. He thought that this strange girl might be an incarnation, since she had such an unusual appearance. But then he hurriedly got out of bed, because he had no time for all this and could not afford to rest for so long. The only thing he was interested in right now was how he could find that hated incarnation of wings, Gyuyo. However, he didn't even have time to get up before streams of black blood flowed from his mouth, nose, and eyes. The little girl stared uncomprehendingly as Ananta tried to cough up the blood. When the streams of blood stopped, he found it difficult to breathe. His vision became blurred and he could barely see anything, just a pool of blood on the floor. He knew it was all payback for overusing the curse. The next moment he fell helplessly from the bed to the floor and thus frightened the little girl. But as soon as he was shaking and struggling to get up, the girl ran outside as if nothing had happened. Behind her she left the door open. Ananta saw this as his chance to escape from here. Outside, he found himself in the middle of a huge cave, with many houses and life bustling around him. But as soon as Ananta found himself in the middle of the street, many of the inhabitants began to look at him fearfully. And they looked at him warily for good reason. He didn't look good, and he was barely walking, tearing off his bandages and barely moving his feet. He looked around in confusion, wondering where he was. As he looked around he realized that although the place was very large, he couldn't see the sky. He was probably in an underground city, but how could he be here? He didn't remember how he got here. Suddenly his movement in the crowd was stopped by several guards who ordered him to stop. They explained their demand by saying that he looked suspicious and was clearly not a local. They advised him to surrender without resistance, for if he refused, they would be forced to attack him. Ananta exhaled tiredly. It was the same old story again, only it was the first time he had appeared somewhere. The guards always wanted to kick him in the side because of his unusual appearance. He answered them as usual that they could try. But suddenly some man with a sword appeared near him and turned to the guards. And casually asked them if by any chance they had seen their little girl. But while he was talking to the guards, Ananta noticed his arm, or rather the tattoo of a symbol with an eye and wings on it. Ananta immediately remembered how many years ago Whitefoot advised him to memorize this symbol, because it would help him to find the embodiment of wings. He remembered how many of his followers had this symbol. Ananta called out to the stranger and was about to put his hand on his shoulder. But in the next instant he almost lost his arm as the sword whistled through the air. Ananta managed to dodge, but the sword whistled just millimeters from his eye. It was very close and the sword even clipped Ananta's hair a little. The stranger turned to him and said with a smile that he was sorry about that, but he didn't like being touched on the shoulder from behind. Ananta was not about to let such insolence go unpunished and regained his balance. He immediately delivered a crushing blow with his fist, which the stranger still managed to dodge. The stranger looked at Ananta and thought to himself that this man was really strong. The stranger jumped away, breaking the distance, and said that it was a good attempt, but now it would be his turn. But he thought to himself, wow, this man looks like he's going to drop dead, but he's not afraid to fight back. And there was a very powerful aura emanating from Ananta, which his opponent could see and was beginning to regret getting involved. Ananta wasn't going to fight for nothing either, so he asked the swordsman how he got that mark on his right hand. And what did it have to do with the incarnation of wings? But he didn't get an answer. Instead the swordsman quickly attacked. Ananta barely managed to dodge the first blow. But it was followed by a series of blows, several of which left deep cuts on the chest of our protagonist. The swordsman wielded the sword, which seemed to be an extension of his arm, and with it he unmistakably struck blow after blow. Ananta, retreating, was forced to press himself against the wall. The swordsman, seeing that his enemy was confused, smugly told him that if he wanted answers, he should try harder. And added that the only option for him to get answers was to beat them out by force. His sword glistened as he prepared a crushing blow about to finish off this poor wounded monster. With a single sword thrust, a cutting wave of tremendous force rushed towards our protagonist and smoke flew in all directions, enveloping everything around him. It wasn't clear if the blow had hit its target or not. When the dust cleared, the swordsman was surprised by what he saw. Ananta had partially transformed into a beast and defended himself from the blow with his hands. A large cut was visible on the wall behind his back, but he was unharmed. And now he was staring at his opponent with a vicious and focused stare. The swordsman pretended to have everything under control and asked with a sneer, what happened to his hands? While the guards did not share his calmness and in horror sent a messenger to inform the queen of what was happening and request reinforcements as soon as possible. Ananta's eyes flashed with rage and he rushed to the attack with his clawed hand. He wasn't going to take it any further. His strike was powerful and fast, but the swordsman managed to dodge and casually reflect it with his sword. The swordsman dodged blow after blow and realized that each attack was powerful enough that if he met it directly, his sword would most likely fail. But he immediately noticed that his opponent had a weakness. As he was now far from his best condition and after a series of such attacks, was breathing heavily and seemed to be barely standing on his feet. Suddenly Ananta bent over in a fit of coughing. The swordsman saw his opportunity in this and realizing that this was his chance to win rushed into the attack. With one lightning-fast and masterfully honed lunge, he stabbed Ananta in the chest. Usually in such cases it was already over, and the swordsman was sure of his victory, but this was an unusual case. Instead of dropping dead, Ananta's body began to blaze with black flames and curse began to spread all over his body. The swordsman didn't realize what was happening. Ananta no longer looked like a human, his face was gradually turning into the toothy mouth of a black dragon. His face was distorted by a grimace of rage, his eyes began to blaze with fire, and he let out a terrifying roar. The terrified swordsman was forced to retreat, he drew his sword from Ananta and jumped away. Ananta meanwhile screamed horribly in pain and continued to transform into a dragon. In a moment, the dragon-like lizard was already standing in front of the swordsman blazing with anger and rage. The inhabitants of the underground city, who saw all this, froze with fear and horror, unable to even move. Even on the face of the swordsman flashed a shadow of doubt and fear, his hand trembled. The terrifying beast from his nightmares, all in black flames of rage, was approaching him. The swordsman realized that his sword would be as useless as a toothpick in this situation and returned it to its scabbard. He finally realized what emotion he had experienced a moment ago. He seemed to have experienced what real fear was for the first time in his life. Compared to such a gigantic monster, he was so small and useless, but he still wasn't going to give up and prepared to accept his fate. But suddenly he was called out by a voice that called him owl and told him to retreat. It was Queen Ragelsa, who had personally come to the rescue and was now preparing to deliver a crushing blow to the beast. She delivered a mighty blow right to the neck at the base of the beast's skull. Such a blow would have severed the bear's head instantly, but it only left a small cut that made the dragon roar furiously. The queen stood right in front of it, surrounded by a squad of warriors. They surrounded the beast on all sides and blood was pouring from the wound in its neck, but it seemed that none of this could hold the dragon back at all. Nadia begged them to stop, not to harm it or kill it because it was not their enemy at all. But Queen Ragelsa was of a different opinion. She said that since he had harmed her people, she would not keep him alive. After that, she got into a fighting stance and said that she would finish off this ugly monster right here. The dragon's eyes flashed with red rage. But what happened next surprised everyone present. It raised its giant clawed paw. And in a lightning-fast movement, he thrust his claws in. The queen stared at him with incomprehension. What kind of mad creature could be capable of such a thing? It appeared that Ananta had sunk his claws right into the slit in his neck. Rag Elsa didn't understand why he was doing this. But he didn't stop there and thrust his other hand into the wound and began to tear it open with both hands. With a sickening sound his head began to separate from his torso. It was a sight not for the weak. The warriors around him also didn't understand what he was doing and why he was killing himself. Eventually he ripped off his own head and fell as a flaming corpse to the ground. Of all those present only Nadia felt sorry for him. The others looked at the burning corpse with fear and incomprehension. The queen also wondered who the hell he was. Even though he had made his damn dragon kill himself, Ananta was still alive and now lay unconscious on the ground. After a while, one of the female warriors was reporting to the queen. She reported that according to her instructions, the barbarian had been imprisoned in a dungeon and placed under vigilant guard. So was the embodiment of nature, who was also in custody and awaiting her judgment. Right now they were still looking for witnesses, but at first glance that scene of the rampaging monster was an eerie chaos. Another warrior added that soon rumors would spread around the fortress and it was only a matter of time before the people would start demanding the execution of that beast, the demonic incarnation. When everyone had gathered around the round table, just like King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, the queen announced that they were starting an emergency meeting and everyone present was already aware of what had happened. The main issue at this meeting is a foreigner named Ananta. And the queen added that she will make a final decision only after listening to all the points of view present here. The first to speak was a woman named Rupa, who was the 4th Levitian commander and the incarnation of ferocity. She asked how long they were going to keep this monster in their fortress and added that there was nothing to decide, just kill it and that was it. Next was Owl, the 3rd Levitian commander and the embodiment of a swordsman. He disagreed with the girl's idea and told her it was very cruel. He advised her to use and research Ananta because he is a very curious character. Next was Tarkan, 2nd in command of Levitian and the incarnation of conquest. He said he didn't care at all. After listening to them the queen turned to Bernhard and asked if he knew of this barbarian's abilities. He confidently replied that, yes he knew. Bernhard was the 1st Levitian commander and the incarnation of valor. Hearing his answer Rupa was indignant, asking him if he was joking. Why did he bring this monster into the fortress and what was he thinking if he knew how dangerous it was? Bernhard replied that he agreed that Ananta's presence had caused chaos. However, he still felt that they should have left him here. He turned to the queen and added that his power was undoubtedly very great and dangerous and yet he absolutely harbored a hatred for the incarnation of the wings like everyone here. If they could get this power and strength under control, it would become an extremely useful weapon in their hands. After listening to everyone, the queen made her decision. She decided that it should be kept as an auxiliary force. Rupa disagreed with this decision and resented how anyone could listen to such idiotic suggestions. She looked for support among the actions present and turned to Owl, reminding him that he had fought him and saying that if he was more serious he could have solved their monster problem with one blow and there would be no problem now. But he didn't see it that way and replied to her that it wasn't really right of him to say that, considering that he himself had forced that fight. Lastly, he added that Bernhard was right and this guy would be very useful. He recalled the moment from the fight with Ananta and said that if they had fought seriously and to the very end, neither of them would have left in one piece. Such words surprised Rupa very much and she asked, "What?" But still, all of Rupa's outrage had no effect on anything since the queen had already made her final decision. Just at that moment a silhouette appeared at the beginning of the hall. Upon seeing it, the queen told the messenger of the Rabbit's Foot Information Agency to enter. Whitefoot, already familiar to us, entered the meeting room. She joyfully announced to everyone that Whitefoot, the nicest of all the agency's employees, had come by order of the queen. While the meeting was going on upstairs somewhere deep down in the dungeon a lonely prisoner was languishing. Ananta was firmly chained in 3 chains at once, which of course could not hold him if he let loose his curse, but he did not want to do that himself just yet. As it turned out he had visitors with another messenger from the Rabbit's Foot Agency. She asked Ananta-san how he was doing. She went on to say that she had already feared he would run away with his tail between his legs, but as it turned out there was no need to worry. Ananta in reply only looked at her with his tired look. When the messenger saw him, she admired the look, so much so that she said it made her lose her temper. Who was she? Whitefoot came closer and said hello to the great empress and the glorious heroes present. She said cheerfully that as a humble information merchant she was paying her respects to all of them. All but the queen stared at her, they didn't understand who she was or how she got here. On top of that she wasn't herself, she had the same little girl with her that had been next to the unconscious Ananta and now she was holding Ruby the lizard, who seemed to have accepted her fate as a teddy bear. Owl greeted the little girl cheerfully. He called her Raclette, and said she was like a walking nuisance and would disappear in a flash if distracted by something else for even a minute. Whitefoot advised him not to minimize his merit, for the little one had the same power as she did and could subdue space. Bernhard looked at the messenger and asked the queen who she was. The queen appeared to be familiar with her and replied that she was a highly ranked member of a news agency known as the Rabbit's Foot. And a few weeks ago she had offered her a deal. Then with her sweet smile Whitefoot asked the queen if she was interested in the power to destroy the incarnation of wings. Then she went on to say that at first she had regarded such a request as half-crazy nonsense, but now she was sure it was possible. It was as if Whitefoot had it all figured out and calculated ahead. Then the queen was intrigued by her offer and asked that she state her terms and what she wanted in exchange for her services. Whitefoot clapped her hands happily and said that their conversation was moving gently and beautifully, and the only thing she desires is a continued partnership between Rabbitfoot and Levitian. In return, their organization would use all of their power to help them defeat Wing's incarnation. And will offer them the services of Revenge Incarnation. While the queen was telling the terms of the deal to her charges, the doors of the dungeon Ananta was in were already open. The chains that held Ananta were also broken. And just as Whitefoot finished presenting her terms she was interrupted by a voice that said it was all garbage information. The girl rabbit was at once awkwardly silent from this. The queen and everyone present stared in surprise at whoever had come. He asked, how dare they claim to be able to surpass someone by making all this noise? It doesn't matter what it is, cooperation or compromise, none of this is necessary. The mouse girl looked questioningly at her guest. The lizard that was in her arms immediately came to life and was happy to see a familiar face. It immediately jumped out of the little girl's arms and ran towards its master with a squeal. Ananta continued his speech saying that the only one who will kill the incarnation of Wings is him. And no one dare stand in his way. Rupa immediately became enraged and started transforming into his incarnation saying that he is a scoundrel and a criminal and should be in the dungeon. And anyway, what are the guards doing here that he is walking around unhindered? She turned to the queen and asked her to just give the order and she would beat the crap out of this guy right now. The queen ordered her to calm down because she wants to hear what he's offering. Rag Elsa turned her attention to Ananta's scars, which covered his entire body. Each of those scars spoke of the number of battles he had fought in. And the frenzied energy that flowed intensely under his skin and filled him. It couldn't be compared to anything she'd seen before. So he was a carnage in the flesh, this human embodiment of carnage and revenge. Whitefoot immediately became worried and lost all her confidence. She pointed to Ananta and said that this was the strongest trump card of their organization. But Ananta did not tolerate this attitude and immediately put his hand on Whitefoot's head making her shriek in fright. With a grim face he looked at her and asked her since when did he become the property of their organization, did she want to die with such statements? While Ananta was showing Whitefoot who was in charge, another female employee of the news agency approached him from behind. She quietly approached him from behind, hugged his arm, and said that despite everything he had lost to the incarnation of the Wings, it would be difficult for him to go it alone and that's why he needed allies. Ananta looked at her incredulously and thought to himself, what a bastard. The rabbit girl called Blackfoot looked at Whitefoot's situation and commented that she seemed to be having a hard time. Whitefoot replied, it's exactly as you can see. But then she said that more important than that was that Ananta was losing control again and it looked like the adjustment of his powers was complete according to their plan. But suddenly the queen intervened in all this and asked Ananta directly if he was really capable of killing the incarnation of the Wings. Whitefoot immediately began to say that according to their treaty. But the queen with a serious look stopped her at once, saying that she was asking Ananta and not her. And added that Ananta's origin was of no importance to them. Ananta was in no hurry to answer, and the queen continued by saying that she still had certain doubts about him, but she had also seen his power with her own eyes. All those gathered here have one single goal, to destroy the incarnation of the wings. And that goal also served as the basis for the creation of their organization. For example, the person he recently engaged in a fierce battle with, Ao, the swordsman incarnation. He was once a member of a clan that served the incarnation of wings, but the clan was destroyed by one of its members who harbored a grudge and gained power from the incarnation of wings. For this he swore vengeance and burned the mark on his hand with his own hand. And the queen had gladly accepted him into the ranks of their organization for it. Now what the queen saw was the savage rage that Ananta felt for the incarnation of the wings. Ananta finally spoke and asked the queen what her name was. She immediately replied that her name was Ragelsa Einherjar. Ananta finally left Whitefoot's head alone and asked the queen rhetorically if she wanted to know if he could kill the incarnation of wings. He confidently declared, clenching his fist, that he possessed a power that had almost no limits. In fact, the more cursed beasts and incarnations he devoured, the more power he gained from them. Because of this, his strength was able to grow endlessly. And once he regained all his power and devoured all the monsters, he would tear the wing incarnation apart. So he advised them to shut up and cooperate with him because it was the only way for them to fulfill their goal. Rupa was so cocky and insolent that she asked him if he had lost his nerve, but the queen seemed to think otherwise. And the next moment she laughed out loud, saying, "Truly a shameless fellow." After that she rose from her throne and said, "Well." She began to walk up to our hero and swear the honor of a queen. That Leviathan would join with him, the embodiment of vengeance, in an alliance. So the legendary alliance was made, and now the incarnation of wings had no chance or not. After that, the queen immediately summoned her 2 assistants. And told them to bring Nadia here. Meanwhile, somewhere far beyond the borders of their world in the sanctuary of the wing incarnation. Along the corridor of the sanctuary, the wing's incarnation's protector, whose name was Bekharan, was pacing. He came to the door, stopped and waited to be allowed to enter. After a second, the voice of the wing's incarnation sounded, telling him to enter. The next sight appeared before him. In the arena Ziz had killed another magical beast, and watching the whole thing was the incarnation of wings with 4 other figures. These 4 figures were actual divine incarnations. It turned out that the incarnation of wings had gathered and subjugated 4 of the 6 divine incarnations. Ziz was the 5th. And was laughing maniacally as always after killing the beast. The incarnation of wings, looking at him, solemnly announced that they were celebrating the birth of a new brother. Byron bowed respectfully to his lord and said that he had gathered everyone as he had been ordered. Then the incarnation with a smile told him to open the passage. Byron struck out with his fists. And a passage immediately appeared behind his back. It led to a small island in the middle of the darkness, and the incarnation of wings immediately got ready to go there. As it turned out, there were many horrible monsters and monstrosities below, waiting for the appearance of their lord.